the first light spreads across a landscape that no living traveller would recognize as Egypt. Beyond the Nile, where desert now seems permanent, shallow lakes catch the pale sky. Grass bends in the wind across open country. Herds move through regions that will one day become dunes and stone. People travel between waterholes, seasonal wetlands, river channels, and distant uplands, following fish, wild plants, grazing animals, and the uncertain rhythm of rain. There are no pyramids on the horizon, no temple pylons, no royal names cut into walls, no surviving inscription speaks of Horus, Osiris, Seth, or Ra. The land that will eventually become Egypt has not yet been united, and the institution later called pharaonic kingship lies thousands of years in the future. Yet something essential is already taking shape. Human communities are learning to understand a world in which water can return life to dry ground. Animals can cross the boundary between danger and protection, and the dead can remain present through memory, place, and ritual. Before the gods possess written names, the forces from which those gods will eventually emerge are already everywhere. Around 10,000 years ago, northeastern Africa stands within the long environmental transformation known as the African Humid Period. It began much earlier, around 14,800 years ago, as shifting patterns of Earth's orbit strengthened the seasonal rains reaching northward. The Sahara does not become a single endless garden, and the old phrase Green Sahara can make the change sound more uniform than it really is. Conditions vary sharply from one region to another. Some areas hold substantial lakes and grasslands. Others remain dry or become habitable only during favourable seasons. Even during its wetter centuries, this world is unstable. Recent climate evidence indicates that major droughts interrupt the humid period, including severe disruptions around 9,300 and 8,200 years ago, with another possible disturbance around 6,300 years ago. A lake that appears dependable across generations can retreat. A grazing route can fail. A familiar basin can become dust. Water is generous, but it is never simply obedient. That uncertainty matters because religion does not begin as a finished collection of myths. It grows from repeated encounters with forces that sustain life while refusing human control. Rain falls somewhere beyond sight. A dry hollow fills with water. Fish appear in pools separated from the river. Migrating birds arrive with the seasons and vanish again. Cattle and wild bovids embody nourishment, wealth, strength, and dangerous power. Crocodiles lie almost invisible at the water's edge. Hippopotamuses move between river and land with a force that can overturn the fragile order of a human camp. Falcons circle above territories too large to see from the ground. Serpents disappear into cracks and emerge from places that seem connected to the earth itself. None of this proves that prehistoric communities worshipped the later Egyptian gods under their familiar names. Scholars still debate how much continuity can safely be traced across the immense distance between early Holocene life and the documented religion of dynastic Egypt. But the landscape provides a vocabulary of power long before anyone writes a divine name. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The story unfolding here is not about a forgotten dynasty of supernatural rulers. It is about the much slower and more remarkable process by which landscapes become sacred. Symbols accumulate meanings, and human authority begins to borrow the language of nature. The distinction is important. Later Egyptians will describe a primeval age when gods ruled before human kings, and much later readers will sometimes treat those traditions as corrupted historical records. Yet the surviving evidence leads elsewhere. 10,000 years ago, there is no Egyptian state waiting beneath the sand, no verified line of divine monarchs, and no contemporary text preserving their reigns. What exists instead is a mosaic of mobile and semi-mobile communities whose worlds are structured by movement, seasonality, memory, and access to water. Some of those communities live around playas and temporary lakes far from the Nile Valley. At places such as Gebel Ramla and Nabta Playa in Egypt's western desert, archaeology preserves traces of repeated occupation during windows when water and vegetation make life possible. People leave stone tools, hearths, pottery, animal remains, wells, and eventually more formal arrangements of stones and burials. Their pottery is particularly revealing. In parts of Africa, ceramic technology appears among communities that do not yet depend on settled farming, overturning the old assumption that pots must follow agriculture and permanent village life. A vessel can be useful to mobile people for processing plants, storing water, cooking fish, or managing seasonal abundance. New research suggests that early pottery emerged in more than one African region, rather than spreading from a single point of invention. The people of northeastern Africa are not passive recipients waiting for civilization to arrive from elsewhere. They are experimenting, exchanging knowledge, and responding independently to local conditions. The same caution applies to ancestry. Ancient DNA recovered from Takakori in the central Sahara, although geographically distant from the Nile, reveals a deeply rooted North African lineage among pastoral communities living roughly 7,000 years ago. It also suggests that herding could spread partly through cultural transmission, as people adopted animals and practices without being entirely replaced by newcomers. The evidence remains incomplete, and two individuals cannot describe the population history of an entire continent. Still, they challenge an overly simple tale, in which everything later associated with Egypt arrives through one migration from Western Asia. Northeastern Africa is already inhabited by communities with long local histories, while contact with the Levant, Nubia, the Mediterranean coast, and other parts of the Sahara adds new people, animals, objects, and ideas over time. Egypt's future culture will emerge from those entanglements, not from an isolated river and not from a single invading source. What these people believe cannot be reconstructed in detail. No prayers survive, no one has preserved the name of a spirit associated with a particular lake, animal, storm, or ancestral place. Archaeologists must work with material traces, and material traces are stubbornly ambiguous. A carefully positioned burial may indicate concern for the dead, but it does not reveal an exact doctrine of the afterlife. Red pigment placed with a body may carry ritual meaning, yet that meaning cannot be read as if it were writing. An unusual animal deposit may reflect reverence, status, feasting, sacrifice, companionship, or several of these at once. Even a stone arrangement aligned with part of the sky does not provide a complete theology. The temptation is to project the familiar pantheon backward, naming every falcon Horus and every bovine image Hathor. Responsible interpretation must resist that comfort. Similar forms can acquire different meanings, and symbols can be reworked across centuries until their earlier significance is almost impossible to recover. Still, uncertainty does not leave an empty landscape. What survives in the record suggests that certain places become more than convenient camps. People return to them. They dig wells, revisit graves, handle objects whose value exceeds ordinary utility, and mark spaces that connect present communities with remembered predecessors. In a mobile world, a place of return can anchor identity more strongly than a permanent wall. A burial ground can claim a relationship with land. A striking hill, reliable spring, or seasonal lake can hold stories shared across generations. The dead may become part of the geography, while animals moving through that geography carry qualities humans recognize but cannot fully possess: the falcon's height, the bull's strength, the crocodile's hidden patience, the serpent's renewal through shedding skin. As the climate shifts, these relationships become more urgent. Wet phases open broad territories, drought narrows the choices. Groups that once moved across lakes and grasslands increasingly face a world in which dependable water lies closest to the Nile and its connected basins. This is not one sudden migration from an emptied Sahara into a waiting valley. The process unfolds unevenly over millennia, with movement in several directions and many communities remaining in desert regions whenever conditions permit. But the long tendency carries growing numbers of people toward riverine landscapes where seasonal flooding creates a different rhythm of uncertainty. There, water does not merely fall from the sky or gather briefly in a basin. It rises, spreads, withdraws, and leaves fertility behind. In that repeating movement, the future religious imagination of Egypt finds one of its deepest foundations. The Nile does not create Egyptian religion by itself, and the gods do not simply emerge as poetic labels for natural phenomena. Human belief is never quite so mechanical. Yet the river offers a visible pattern in which disappearance can lead to return. Darkness can precede growth, and destruction can carry renewal within it. Before sacred order becomes a doctrine, it is experienced as a fragile condition that must be watched, remembered, and perhaps assisted through ritual. Before divine kings claim to maintain the balance of the cosmos, communities already know that life depends on forces larger than any individual. And before the first gods receive names that endure in writing, the river begins teaching time itself how to return. The river's lesson is not simply that life returns, it is that return has a pattern, and that pattern can be watched. Across the Nile Valley, people learn to read small changes that modern eyes might miss: the color of the water, the speed of the current, the appearance of birds, the moisture beneath a layer of soil, the movement of fish into newly flooded ground. Far to the south, rains fall over highlands and equatorial regions most inhabitants of the Egyptian Nile will never see. Their waters travel immense distances before reaching the valley, so the flood arrives as an effect whose cause lies beyond the familiar horizon. Local skies may remain almost cloudless while the river rises. To communities living beside it, this must seem like one of the landscape's most profound contradictions. Water comes without rain. Fertility appears from a distant, unseen world. The river brings evidence that invisible events can govern visible life. The annual inundation later becomes one of the organizing principles of Egyptian time. Dynastic Egyptians will divide the year into seasons associated with inundation, emergence, and harvest, using the names Akhet, Peret, and Shemu. Those formal terms belong to a literate state that does not yet exist in the prehistoric valley, and they should not be projected backward as though early Holocene communities already followed a pharaonic calendar. Yet the physical cycle behind them is much older. Rising water spreads across low ground and deposits fine sediment. As it withdraws, moist soil remains, allowing plants to grow where the desert would otherwise permit almost nothing. The floodplain changes shape from year to year. Channels migrate. Islands form and disappear. Banks collapse. pools become isolated from the main current, trapping fish and supporting birds, reeds, and small animals. The landscape is not merely watered, it is remade. This regularity is powerful, but it is never perfect. A flood that rises too little can leave fields dry and reduce food supplies. One that rises too far or too quickly can damage dwellings, disturb stored goods, erode banks, and force people onto higher ground. The river therefore resists a simple division between benevolent and hostile. It feeds, carries, separates, joins, conceals, and destroys. Later Egyptian religion will often allow divine beings to hold similarly complex qualities. A god can protect and threaten, heal and punish, sustain order while possessing a dangerous form. That habit of thought does not need to begin as abstract theology. It matches the lived experience of a river whose gift cannot be separated from its force. The abundance of the floodplain exists because water crosses ordinary boundaries, and anything powerful enough to create abundance is also powerful enough to exceed human plans. Evidence from freshwater shells and sediments in the Saqqara-Memphis floodplain indicates that conditions during parts of the Predynastic era were generally wetter than in later periods, though rainfall and flood behavior changed significantly over time. Such evidence is valuable because ancient climate cannot be reduced to a smooth decline from wet to dry. Different parts of the Nile system respond to different sources of rainfall, and local communities experience those changes through particular channels, basins, and stretches of floodplain. A good flood near one settlement may not produce the same conditions farther away. No single explanation fully accounts for every shift in population or ritual practice. Climate influences human choices, but it does not dictate them. People adapt through mobility, storage, exchange, fishing, herding, cultivation, and social cooperation. Their response to the river is practical, yet practicality and sacred meaning are not opposites. The repeated work of surviving the flood cycle can itself become ritualized. The river also teaches direction. It flows northward toward the Mediterranean, while prevailing winds often make it possible to sail southward. Long before large states organize fleets, this unusual pairing gives travel along the Nile a natural reciprocity. A vessel can move downstream with the current and return upstream under sail when conditions allow. Communities separated by great distances remain connected through a corridor that is difficult, sometimes dangerous, but rarely meaningless. Stone, shells, pigments, animals, plant products, crafted objects, and stories can travel along it. So can styles of burial and ways of representing authority. The Nile does not erase regional difference. Upper and Lower Egypt will retain distinctive identities even after political unification, but the river makes those differences aware of one another. It provides a long axis along which ideas can move, be copied, altered, resisted, and eventually gathered into wider systems. Along that axis, the contrast between fertile ground and surrounding desert becomes visually absolute. The boundary may be crossed in a few steps dark, moist soil on one side, pale or reddish dryness on the other. In later Egyptian language, the cultivated valley will be remembered as the Black Land, while the desert becomes the Red Land. These names belong to historical Egypt, but they express a much older environmental reality. The floodplain supports dense plant life, animals, and increasingly concentrated human activity. The desert preserves stone, offers mineral resources, provides routes toward distant regions, and contains places for hunting, burial, retreat, and danger. It is not simply an evil wasteland. Nor is the riverbank purely safe. The two zones depend on each other even as they appear opposed. Later religious thought will turn such contrasts into relationships between fertility and barrenness, order and disruption, life and death. Prehistoric people need not possess those exact categories to experience the landscape from which they grow. Night adds another cycle. The sun descends beyond the western desert and returns in the east. The moon changes shape and restores itself. Certain stars disappear for part of the year and become visible again. Birds arrive seasonally. Vegetation dies back and reappears. Human life is surrounded by repetition, but repetition never guarantees an identical outcome. A flood returns, yet its height changes. The sun returns, yet a person buried yesterday does not rise with it. This tension between cosmic recurrence and individual mortality becomes one of the enduring problems of Egyptian religion. How can the dead participate in renewal? How can an unstable world be persuaded to continue its proper course? The elaborate answers of later funerary texts are far away, but the question can exist before writing. It begins whenever people compare the reliable return of natural cycles with the apparent finality of death. The Nile's flood carries another quiet mystery. Its fertile silt originates far beyond the political boundaries later Egyptians will draw. Life in the north depends on distant lands, especially rainfall systems to the south and southeast. The river therefore binds Egypt to regions its rulers will sometimes treat as foreign, dangerous, desirable, or sacred. Nubia is not merely a neighbour outside the story of Egypt. It is part of the larger northeastern African world through which people, livestock, technologies, and religious ideas circulate. The same is true of desert routes leading westward toward the Sahara and eastward toward the Red Sea. The valley concentrates life, but it never seals itself off. Even the most recognizable Egyptian symbols will emerge within networks extending beyond the narrow strip of green visible on a modern map. As communities become more familiar with the flood's timing, anticipation gains social value. Someone who knows when to move animals, repair a shelter, gather food, prepare a vessel, or avoid low ground possesses useful authority. Knowledge of place and season can be preserved through elders, skilled specialists, ritual leaders, and repeated communal practices. Archaeology cannot identify the first person who transformed environmental knowledge into sacred authority, and it may never be possible to separate those roles cleanly. A practical leader can also guide ritual. A successful gathering can become a ceremonial occasion. An inherited story can encode observations about water, weather, animals, and danger over generations. Remembering the pattern becomes a way of protecting the community, and those who claim special access to that pattern can acquire influence. This does not yet produce a priesthood in the later institutional sense, much less a divine monarch. It creates the conditions in which sacred knowledge can matter. The river appears orderly enough to inspire confidence and unpredictable enough to require humility. It makes abundance possible but demands cooperation across time. Food gathered during favourable months must outlast leaner ones. Boats and fishing places require negotiated access. Groups must decide where to camp, when to move, and which locations deserve repeated return. Some places become associated with successful harvests, ancestral burials, unusual animals, or striking natural features. Memory settles unevenly across the landscape. Gradually, the Nile ceases to be only a source of water. It becomes a structure through which people understand continuity. Its rise and withdrawal divide time into meaningful phases, Its northward flow connects distant communities. Its margins reveal the closeness of fertility and desolation. Its hidden sources suggest powers operating beyond sight. Long before scribes describe a cosmic order maintained by gods and kings, people live inside an environment where survival depends on recognizing order without ever assuming complete control. The river does not hand them a finished religion. It gives them rhythms, oppositions, roots, dangers, and returns. Human communities will supply the stories, rituals, images, and eventually the names. As the wider green world begins to contract, those communities draw closer to the river's dependable uncertainty, bringing with them memories formed beside lakes and grasslands that are already starting to vanish. The grasslands do not vanish in a single generation. Their retreat is uneven, interrupted by wetter intervals, remembered through human lifetimes as a sequence of good years, difficult years, and places that no longer behave as they once did. A basin that held water through much of the season begins to dry earlier. Wells must be deepened. Herds travel farther between grazing grounds. Fishing camps lose their reliability. People return to familiar sites and find that familiar plants have thinned or disappeared. No announcement marks the end of the Green Sahara. The change is experienced through 1,000 local losses, each small enough to endure at first, yet together powerful enough to alter the map of human life. Communities respond in different ways. Some remain mobile, adjusting routes and schedules to follow the surviving patches of pasture. Some intensify their use of wells and temporary lakes. Others move toward better watered regions, including the Nile Valley, the Delta, the oases, and lands farther south. The process takes millennia and cannot be described as one great migration of desert people into Egypt. Archaeological gaps remain large, and scholars still debate how particular populations, technologies, and traditions moved across northeastern Africa. Yet the broad environmental pressure is unmistakable. As aridity increases after the height of the African humid period, dependable water becomes more geographically concentrated. The Nile, once one corridor among many habitable zones, becomes increasingly difficult to avoid. People do not arrive at the river empty-handed. They bring knowledge accumulated in grasslands, lake basins, and desert margins, how to find seasonal water, manage animals, process wild foods, make pottery, navigate long distances, and maintain relationships between groups that may meet only at certain times of year. They also bring memories. A community leaving a drying lake does not abandon every story attached to it. Sacred associations can travel even when sacred places cannot. Ritual habits may be adjusted to new landscapes. An animal that once dominated open pasture may retain symbolic importance beside the river. A way of positioning the dead may survive long after the route connecting former camps has closed. The archaeological record rarely allows such continuities to be traced with certainty, but cultural change is seldom a clean replacement of one world by another. Nabta Playa preserves an especially revealing glimpse of this long transition. In what is now a harsh part of Egypt's western desert, early Holocene groups once returned when seasonal rainfall filled shallow basins and supported vegetation. They dug wells, made pottery, hunted, gathered plants, and eventually incorporated cattle into their lives. Later phases include burials and arrangements of stone that have attracted considerable attention. Popular accounts sometimes describe Nabta Playa as a lost astronomical civilization or a direct ancestor of pharaonic religion. Those claims go beyond what the evidence can securely demonstrate. The site is extraordinary without exaggeration. It shows that communities in the Egyptian Sahara organized repeated gatherings, invested labour in particular locations and mark the landscape long before dynastic Egypt. What those stones meant in full remains unknown, but they belong to people capable of turning a seasonal place into a focus of enduring memory. Farther south and west, sites around Gebel Ramla reveal other communities using playa environments through changing climatic phases. Early hunter-gatherers occupied these basins before pastoral lifeways became prominent. Later cemeteries and more elaborate burial practices suggest that social identity was becoming materially visible. Yet even here, the evidence does not reveal a single road leading inevitably toward the pharaohs. Some communities may have contributed people or practices to the Nile Valley. Others followed histories that remained distinct. The desert is not merely a waiting room for Egypt. It is a region with its own experiments in mobility, herding, ceremony, and monumentality. Its importance lies partly in showing how many different histories converged around the Nile without becoming identical. By roughly the 6th and 5th millennia BCE, settlements and cemeteries along the river and in the delta begin to reveal more sustained forms of village life, at places associated with the Badarian tradition in Upper Egypt. Communities cultivate crops, keep livestock, fish, hunt, manufacture fine pottery, and bury their dead in organized cemeteries. Their polished red vessels with darkened rims become among the most recognizable objects of early Egyptian archaeology. These pots are technically accomplished, but they are more than evidence of craftsmanship. Some are placed in graves, where ordinary materials enter a setting of memory and identity. Stone tools, ornaments, animal products, and other possessions accompany the dead. Differences among burials suggest that social distinctions are becoming more visible, though the scale and meaning of those distinctions remain debated. In Lower Egypt, the story follows its own path. The Nile Delta is difficult for archaeology because later settlement, agriculture, river movement, and deep deposits have hidden or destroyed much early evidence. For a long time, narratives of Egypt's formation focused heavily on Upper Egyptian centres such as Nakada, Abydos, and Hierakonpolis. More recent research emphasizes that Delta communities possess their own histories of farming, craft, exchange, and social development. Sites connected with traditions such as Mahdi and Buto reveal contact with the Levant, as well as relationships within Egypt. Copper, pottery styles, stone, shells, and food products move through networks wider than any one village. Lower Egypt is not an empty territory awaiting conquest from the south. It is a populated and connected region whose traditions will help shape the country that emerges. Genetic evidence, though still extremely limited, supports a picture of connection without simple replacement. A genome recovered from a man buried at Nuweirat during the Old Kingdom, much later than these prehistoric villages, shows ancestry largely related to North African Neolithic populations, with a smaller component connected to the Eastern Fertile Crescent. One individual cannot represent all ancient Egyptians, and the result cannot be projected unchanged across thousands of years. It nevertheless fits a broader archaeological pattern: deep African roots combined with long-distance interaction. Crops, livestock, technologies, and people move between northeastern Africa and Western Asia, but local communities actively select, modify, and integrate what arrives. Village life changes the scale of those choices. A mobile group can leave a difficult place, though movement carries its own risks. A community invested in houses, storage, fields, livestock, graves, and access to a particular section of a river faces different pressures. Land becomes more than terrain crossed during a seasonal round. It holds accumulated labor and the presence of earlier generations. Storage creates surplus, but surplus must be guarded, distributed, and remembered. Livestock represent food and mobility, but also wealth, obligation, and prestige. Fields require coordinated timing. Fishing grounds and river access may become matters of negotiation. The village concentrates cooperation and disagreement in the same space. It also changes the relationship between the living and the dead. Cemeteries establish durable claims in a landscape. When people bury relatives near a settlement or in a repeatedly used area, memory becomes tied to ground that can be revisited. The dead may affirm belonging. These are the predecessors who lived here, and therefore this is where the community belongs. Grave goods distinguish identities, while repeated burial customs create a shared language across generations. None of this proves a detailed doctrine of resurrection or divine judgment. The evidence remains incomplete, but it does show that death is being managed through increasingly consistent material practices. Bodies are positioned, objects selected, pigments applied, and burial places maintained. The treatment of the dead becomes one of the clearest surviving windows into a sacred world that otherwise leaves no written explanation. Within settlements, everyday activities also carry meanings that archaeology can only partly recover. Grain is transformed through grinding, baking, and brewing. Clay becomes vessels through fire. Stone from distant sources becomes tools and ornaments. Cattle, sheep, goats, fish, birds, and wild game connect households to different environments. Some objects are used until broken, others are deposited in graves or special contexts while still valuable. Feasting can gather scattered groups, reinforce alliances, display abundance, and create obligations. Ritual may occur in open areas, houses, cemeteries, or temporary structures that leave little trace. The later monumental temple can mislead the imagination, encouraging the belief that religion requires stone walls. In prehistoric villages, the sacred may be carried in gestures, food, body treatment, animal handling, storytelling, and chosen places. As the Sahara dries further, the Nile Valley becomes more crowded, connected, and socially varied. Regional traditions do not disappear. They encounter one another through exchange, intermarriage, travel, competition, and occasional conflict. Images and objects begin to circulate across wider areas, yet their meanings can change as they move. A symbol familiar in one community may be adopted by another for a different purpose. A powerful animal may represent danger in one setting, protection in another, and elite authority in a third. This fluidity is precisely what makes the origins of Egyptian gods so difficult to reconstruct. The pantheon known from later temples is not waiting fully formed inside these villages. It is being assembled slowly from many local worlds. Those worlds are now compressed along a river where animals from water, marsh, field, and desert meet within a narrow corridor. Falcons cross the sky above cattle pens. Crocodiles occupy channels used by fishers. Hippopotamuses enter cultivated ground. Serpents hide near houses and granaries. Wild canids move around desert cemeteries. Each creature possesses abilities that exceed the human body and habits that seem to cross natural boundaries. In settlements carrying the memories of a vanishing green world, animals become more than neighbours. They offer forms through which danger, strength, fertility, vigilance, death, and protection can be imagined and eventually made visible. To live beside the Nile is to share a narrow world with creatures that seem to possess access to different realms. A crocodile disappears beneath reflective water and returns almost without warning. A falcon rises above the valley until the human landscape contracts beneath it. A serpent enters a fissure in the ground, sheds its old skin, and emerges with a surface that appears renewed. A hippopotamus spends daylight partly concealed in the river, then moves onto land after dark with astonishing strength. Cattle transform grass into milk, meat, hides, horn, labour, wealth, and social obligation. Wild canids cross the desert margin where settlements give way to cemeteries. These animals do not need to be mistaken for gods in order to become religiously powerful. Their bodies already demonstrate abilities humans lack, and their movements connect regions of existence that human beings experience as separate. The familiar image of Egyptian religion, in which a human body bears the head of a falcon, jackal, ibis, or other creature, can make the system seem like a straightforward case of animal worship. It is more subtle than that. Later Egyptians do sometimes venerate living animals associated with particular deities, and certain individuals can be recognized as sacred manifestations. Yet animal form more broadly serves as a language of divine qualities. A god shown as a falcon is not merely a large bird receiving worship. The form communicates height, speed, vision, command of the sky, and predatory authority. A crocodile form can hold the terror and generative power of the river. A bovine form can express fertility, maternal care, physical strength, celestial vastness, or royal potency. The animal is not a decorative disguise placed over an otherwise human god. It reveals something that a human shape alone cannot express. This visual language has deep prehistoric roots, but those roots are difficult to name. Predynastic pottery, palettes, combs, knife handles, rock art, tags, and ceremonial objects carry an abundance of animal imagery. Some creatures appear in orderly rows, others dominate scenes of hunting, procession, or conflict. Long-necked felines twist around the surface of pallets, birds perch on standards, bulls overwhelm opponents, canids frame human figures, fish, gazelles, ibex, elephants, hippopotamuses, and crocodiles enter compositions whose rules are only partly understood. It is tempting to treat each image as the earliest portrait of a later god. That approach offers satisfying answers but weak history. The same animal can carry several meanings, and an image can signal geography, status, clan identity, danger, control, ritual performance, or supernatural force without representing a named deity. UCL's careful warning about prehistoric Egyptian religion is therefore essential resemblance does not guarantee identity. A falcon image from the 4th millennium BCE may participate in the symbolic tradition from which Horus later emerges, but without an accompanying name or clear cultic context, it cannot automatically be called Horus. The same caution applies to cattle imagery, and later goddesses such as Hathor or Bat, to Canids and Anubis, and to crocodiles and Sobek. Religious symbols survive partly because they can be reinterpreted. A form that once marked a community, ruler, or landscape may later be absorbed into a divine personality with myths, temples, priests, and family relationships. Continuity is possible, even likely in some cases, but it is rarely simple. Hierakonpolis offers one of the strangest windows into this world of animals and power. At the elite cemetery known as HK6, archaeologists have found carefully arranged burials involving domestic and wild species, including cattle, dogs, baboons, wild cats, hippopotamuses, and elephants. Some of these animals would have been extraordinarily difficult to obtain or manage. Their presence indicates connections extending beyond the immediate settlement and an ability to command labor, knowledge, and rare creatures. The exact meanings remain debated. They may have been companions, offerings, status symbols, protective beings, participants in funerary ceremonies, or embodiments of forces linked to the deceased. No single explanation fully accounts for the variety. What is clear is that elite identity was being constructed not only through valuable objects, but through relationships with the animal world. An elephant at a cemetery does not merely represent an impressive quantity of meat or ivory. Its rarity and scale transform it into evidence of reach. A hippopotamus, dangerous in both river and field, becomes evidence that powerful people can confront or symbolically contain a force threatening cultivated life. A baboon evokes distant regions and unfamiliar behavior. Wild animals placed within an ordered funerary landscape may demonstrate the ability of an elite household to gather the uncontrolled world around itself. That idea will become central to royal imagery. The ruler does not destroy every dangerous force, but shows that such forces have been subordinated, redirected, or held within a greater order. Hunting scenes can operate in a similar way. A hunt is practical, but on a ceremonial object it may become more than the pursuit of food. Wild animals often occupy the edges of the human world, the marsh, desert, river channel, or distant grassland. To pursue them is to enter spaces where ordinary settlement order weakens. Their capture can dramatize mastery over unpredictability. Later, Egyptian kings will be shown hunting dangerous animals as an expression of cosmic and political authority, even when the image is highly stylized. Predynastic scenes do not yet communicate the full royal theology known from historical monuments, but they reveal the symbolic ingredients from which it can be made a powerful human figure, a dangerous landscape, controlled animals, and an audience able to recognize the claim. Cattle occupy a special place because they stand between wildness and human care. They move in herds, require access to water and pasture, and can store wealth in living form. Their survival depends on knowledge and cooperation. In pastoral communities of the Sahara and Nile margins, cattle may structure movement, exchange, marriage obligations, feasting, and social prestige. Horns enlarge the apparent outline of the animal and create a form visible from a distance. Bovine imagery can therefore carry several linked ideas: abundance, virility, nourishment, protection, and elite possession. Later, Egyptian crowns and divine figures will make striking use of horns, often framing a solar disk. But that developed symbolism should not be read unchanged into every prehistoric cattle image. What survives suggests a long fascination, not a fully documented theology. Falcons present a different kind of power. Their domain is vertical. From above, they command a view impossible for people standing among reeds or mud brick structures. Their swift descent transforms stillness into sudden action. A falcon can therefore evoke dominance, distance, surveillance, and the sky. As political authority becomes more centralized in Upper Egypt, falcon symbolism will move increasingly close to kingship, eventually becoming inseparable from the royal Horus identity. Yet before that consolidation, falcons may have carried varied local meanings. Their later success could result precisely from their symbolic flexibility. The bird offers a form capable of representing both a divine presence above the land and the ruler who claims to oversee it. Crocodiles and hippopotamuses embody another tension. Both belong to the life-giving river, yet both can disrupt human activity. The crocodile's stillness makes it almost part of the water until movement reveals it. The hippopotamus crosses between river and cultivated ground, where its appetite and strength can threaten crops. Later religion will not eliminate these contradictions. Crocodile deities can be feared and protective. Hippopotamus forms can represent destructive chaos in one context and fierce guardianship in another. Egyptian sacred thought repeatedly turns danger into protection by placing dangerous power on the side of the worshipper. A threatening creature is not made harmless. Its very capacity to harm becomes the reason it can defend. Serpents perhaps express this principle most clearly. They appear unexpectedly, move without limbs, vanish into the earth, and renew their surface through shedding. Later Egyptian tradition includes serpents who protect kings and gods, serpents who threaten cosmic order, and serpentine forms that encircle or inhabit the hidden world. The upright cobra on the royal brow will become one of the most recognizable emblems of sovereignty. But prehistoric serpent imagery belongs to an earlier and less legible field of meaning. It may involve danger, regeneration, territory, hidden knowledge, or protection. The evidence remains incomplete, and these meanings need not have been mutually exclusive. Animals become sacred not because early Egyptians failed to distinguish humans from other species, but because they observe those distinctions closely. Each creature has a place, a rhythm, a capacity, and a relationship to water, land, sky, or darkness. By combining human and animal forms, later Egyptian artists will not produce monsters in the modern sense. They will construct beings whose identities exceed the limits of one body. The prehistoric foundations of that practice lie in an intense attention to the living world and in the growing use of animals to make power visible. The clearest surviving stage for that visibility is often the cemetery. There, cattle horns, animal skins, ivory, shells, pallets, pigments, vessels, and occasionally animals themselves enter carefully arranged relationships with human bodies. The grave becomes a place where identity can be preserved, transformed, or displayed beyond ordinary life. Animals help define who the dead were, what powers surrounded them, and what kind of passage may have been imagined. Yet the most mysterious presence in these burials is still the human body itself placed deliberately in the earth, accompanied by selected objects, and treated as though death had changed a relationship without entirely ending it. The body at the center of the grave is not discarded. It is arranged. In many predynastic burials, the dead are placed on one side in a contracted position, knees drawn toward the torso, sometimes wrapped in matting, skins, or linen. The grave may contain pottery, beads, stone vessels, pallets, tools, ornaments, food, and pigments. These choices require time. They remove useful objects from circulation and place them where the living cannot ordinarily recover them. Even the simplest burial interrupts daily work and gathers attention around a person who no longer participates in the community as before. Archaeology cannot hear the words spoken at the grave, but deliberate treatment carries its own quiet testimony. Death has occurred, yet the relationship has not simply ended. The contracted position is sometimes described as fetal, encouraging the idea that burial represents a return to the womb and an expectation of rebirth. It is an evocative interpretation, but it cannot be proven as a universal explanation. The position may result from wrapping practices, the dimensions of grave pits, concepts of sleep, inherited custom, or beliefs now lost. Orientations also vary across sites and periods. Some bodies face particular directions. Yet the patterns are not consistent enough to reveal one prehistoric doctrine shared throughout Egypt. The evidence remains incomplete because graves preserve actions more readily than meanings. A pot beside the dead shows that someone selected and deposited it. Whether it held food for a journey, marked status, recalled a feast, served a ritual purpose, or combined all these functions is harder to determine. What can be seen is increasing consistency. When a cemetery is used repeatedly, burial becomes part of a tradition larger than any one funeral. The location matters. The shape of the grave matters. The treatment of the body and the choice of objects follow patterns recognized by the community. People know where earlier generations lie, even when individual graves lack permanent markers that survive into the present. Paths may form among burial areas. Certain zones may be reserved for particular households or persons of unusual standing. The cemetery becomes a social landscape populated by the dead, a place where identity can be displayed, remembered, and negotiated. Its position near the desert edge carries a significance that later Egyptian religion will develop with extraordinary force. The cultivated floodplain is crowded with water, crops, insects, animals, human movement, and seasonal change. The desert is dry, comparatively still, and visually separated from the land of cultivation. It can preserve what wet ground destroys. A burial placed beyond the reach of the inundation remains protected from the river's annual movement, while still overlooking or standing close to the world of the living. Later, Egyptians will associate the western horizon, where the sun descends, with the realm of the dead. Prehistoric cemeteries often occupied desert margins, but it would be too simple to claim that every early burial already expresses the full Western symbolism known from dynastic texts. Practical preservation, available ground, and distance from settlement also matter. Sacred geography can grow from practical choices repeated until they acquire inherited meaning. The dryness of the desert sometimes preserves bodies naturally. Heat and arid sand can remove moisture before decay progresses, leaving skin, hair, and body form unexpectedly recognizable. Such encounters may have influenced later Egyptian concern with physical preservation, but scholars still debate the route from natural desiccation to deliberate mummification. There is no need to imagine one dramatic discovery that suddenly reveals the secret of eternal life. The development is gradual. Wrapping, resins, oils, body treatment, coffin use, and increasingly complex embalming emerge through long experimentation. In the Predynastic period, natural preservation and intentional treatment overlap in ways that are not always easy to separate. Yet the survival of a recognizable body could have made one fact impossible to ignore under certain conditions. A person's physical form could remain after life had departed. That possibility introduces a profound tension. The body is present, but the person is absent. Later Egyptian religion will answer this by describing human identity as composed of several interdependent elements, including bodily form, name, image, vital force, and mobile aspects capable of traveling beyond the tomb. Those formal concepts cannot be confidently projected into prehistoric graves. Still, the material problem is already there. Why preserve or arrange the body if nothing of the individual remains connected to it? Why include ornaments, food, tools, or cosmetic objects if death has reduced the person to matter? Grave offerings suggest, at minimum, that the dead continue to possess an identity meaningful to the living. Some objects appear closely linked to appearance and embodied personhood. Beads, bracelets, combs, pins, palettes, and pigments can accompany the dead. Green minerals used for eye paint, red ochre, and carefully crafted ornaments connect the body to colour, protection, status, or remembered presentation. A palette may have served an ordinary cosmetic purpose before burial, but its placement in a grave alters its context. Later ceremonial palettes will become stages for political and sacred imagery, yet their roots lie partly in smaller objects used to grind pigments. The transformation is characteristic of early Egypt. An everyday practice becomes a ritual medium, and a personal object becomes a carrier of public meaning. Pottery offers another form of continuity. Vessels can hold grain, liquids, oils, or prepared food. Some grave pots show wear from use, others may have been made specifically for burial. Their shapes and decoration help archaeologists establish relative chronologies, but to the people who placed them, they likely held more than chronological value. A container embodies preparation for the future. It encloses something meant to last beyond the present moment. When carried into a grave, it implies provision, remembrance, or ceremonial completion. The dead may no longer eat in any ordinary sense, yet food and drink maintain a social bond. Later, Egyptian funerary religion will turn offerings into a vast and formal system, with images and words capable of renewing supplies eternally. In these early graves, the gesture exists before the written formula. Differences among burials reveal that not every person receives the same treatment. Some graves are larger, richer, or more carefully constructed. Rare materials travel considerable distances before being deposited. Ivory, shells, fine stone, copper, and elaborately made vessels can signal access to exchange networks and specialized labor. At Badarian cemeteries and later Nakada sites, such variation suggests emerging inequality. Though archaeologists disagree about exactly when stable social classes or hereditary elites appear, a wealthy grave does not automatically identify a chief, priest, or ruler. It does, however, show that communities are willing to express distinctions in a setting intended to endure. At Hierakonpolis, the elite cemetery at HK6 intensifies this pattern. Large tombs, associated structures, rare objects, and animal burials create a ceremonial landscape unlike ordinary graves. At Abydos, especially in the cemetery known as el-Kab, increasingly elaborate tombs eventually become associated with powerful rulers of the late Predynastic and early dynastic periods. The path from community burial ground to royal necropolis is not a straight line, but it reveals a growing connection between authority and control over death. A leader who receives exceptional treatment after death may continue to anchor the identity of followers. Successors can claim legitimacy through proximity to that person, through the maintenance of the burial place, or through rituals performed in memory of an ancestral figure. This is one of the ways ancestors can become politically powerful. The dead cannot speak in public disputes, but the living can speak for them. A lineage can claim that its authority comes from predecessors buried in a particular place. A community can gather around tombs during repeated ceremonies. The cemetery becomes an archive without writing, storing relationships in earth, objects, and spatial arrangement. Memory is selective. Some individuals fade, others become founders. Over generations, a remembered ancestor may acquire qualities beyond ordinary human life, especially when descendants connect prosperity, protection, or territorial belonging to the ancestor's continued presence. Yet it would be misleading to treat every revered ancestor as a god in waiting. Ancestor veneration, funerary care, and deity worship can overlap without being identical. Later Egyptian religion will maintain complex relationships among the dead, divine beings, and royal ancestors. Predynastic evidence shows the ingredients, not the finished distinctions. What survives suggests that cemeteries are places where communities practice continuity, the body remains connected to identity, offerings maintain bonds, and burial ground secures memory within the landscape. The grave also teaches the living how permanence can be built. Houses of mud, reeds, and timber require repair and may disappear beneath later settlement. A burial, protected in dry ground and revisited through ritual, can outlast the dwelling of the person placed within it. As elite graves become more elaborate, they demand planning, labour, and space. Activity gathers around them. Posts, fences, offering areas, and temporary ceremonial structures may mark places where the living approach the dead. Most of these constructions vanish, leaving only stains in soil or patterns of post holes. But they represent a crucial threshold. This sacred is beginning to acquire architecture, and the architecture of memory is slowly becoming a place where powers beyond the human world can be approached. The first sacred buildings of Egypt are almost invisible because they were built from materials that belong to the living landscape. Reeds, timber, woven mats, mud plaster, and unfired brick can create an impressive ritual space, but they do not survive like limestone. Floodwater dissolves walls, insects consume wood, wind carries away plant fibers, later settlements cut through earlier foundations, and later temples replace smaller structures on the same revered ground. When archaeologists search beneath the monumental religion of dynastic Egypt, they often find not a miniature stone temple, but a pattern of post holes, shallow trenches, fragments of plaster, concentrations of pottery, animal remains, ash, and objects deposited in unusual ways. From such traces, a sacred architecture must be reconstructed. This creates a misleading contrast between prehistory and the age of the Pharaohs. The later landscape is dominated by stone temples whose walls declare permanence, while the earlier one appears almost empty. Yet absence of stone does not mean absence of ceremony. A timber gateway covered in paint, feathers, hides, or woven material could have been visually overwhelming to people accustomed to low houses and open courtyards. A fence could separate ordinary ground from restricted ground. A roofed shelter could conceal an image or object seen only during particular rites. A pole bearing an animal emblem could make a community's sacred power visible from a distance. None of these structures needs to survive intact to organize human movement, attention, and memory. At Hierakonpolis, the site known as HK29A offers one of the clearest glimpses of a predynastic ceremonial center. Dating mainly to the 4th millennium BCE, it includes a large oval enclosure with substantial wooden posts and evidence of repeated gatherings. Its scale separates it from an ordinary household. Pottery, food remains, and traces of activity suggest communal events that may have involved feasting, production, display, and ritual performance. The precise reconstruction remains debated because wood and matting have vanished, leaving only the negative spaces where supports once stood. Even so, the site demonstrates that people could invest considerable labour in creating a formal gathering place long before Egypt's famous temples rose in stone. The entrance appears to have mattered. Architecture guides the body before it communicates an idea. A narrow opening controls who enters and in what order. A screen blocks direct sight. A courtyard gathers people while an inner structure restricts access. Processions turn movement into hierarchy. Some individuals lead, some carry objects, some remain outside, and some witness only the public part of an event. Later, Egyptian temples will develop this principle into a long sequence of increasingly restricted spaces, from open courts toward a hidden sanctuary. It would be unsafe to claim that HK29A already follows the complete theological plan of a dynastic temple. Yet the basic ritual use of boundaries, approaches, and controlled visibility is much older than monumental stone. Feasting may have been central to such gatherings. Large quantities of food and drink do more than satisfy hunger. They draw people together at appointed times, convert surplus into social obligation, and allow leaders to demonstrate generosity. Brewing and food preparation require coordinated labor. Animals, fish, grain, and vessels must be obtained, processed, and distributed. Guests carry memories of the event back to their households and communities. A feast can renew alliances, honor ancestors, mark a seasonal transition, or acknowledge a power associated with a place. It can also display inequality with remarkable efficiency, since the person who provides abundance usually makes certain that everyone notices. Ritual and politics are already difficult to separate. A gathering organized around sacred objects can strengthen the authority of those who control access to them. A leader capable of bringing distant groups together appears to command more than labor. Success may be interpreted as evidence of favor from ancestors, animals, landscape powers, or emerging deities. Conversely, ritual failure can become political failure. The relationship is reciprocal. Authority makes ceremonies possible, and ceremonies make authority appear natural. Later, pharaohs will claim that their rule maintains cosmic order, but the foundation of that claim lies in earlier communities where leadership is demonstrated through the successful management of gatherings, resources, and sacred places. Other evidence comes from funerary settings. At the elite cemetery of HK6, wooden structures associated with graves suggest that burial areas could include above-ground architecture, perhaps serving ceremonies conducted before or after interment. At Abydos, increasingly elaborate tombs and associated ritual spaces eventually transform a cemetery into a center of royal memory. These places remind us that the categories of temple, tomb, palace, and communal enclosure may not yet be sharply separated. A structure can honor the dead, host a feast, display authority, store ritual objects, and mark sacred territory at the same time. Modern labels help organize excavation reports, but prehistoric people were under no obligation to build according to later archaeological categories. Portable objects may also preserve hints of vanished shrines, ceremonial palettes, mace heads, ivory carvings, pottery scenes, and early labels show standards, poles, canopied structures, boats, enclosures, and emblematic animals. Some images may depict actual architecture or ritual equipment. Others may condense ideas into visual signs. A small shape carried on a standard could represent a community, a deity, a sacred place, or a political unit. Later Egyptian writing will turn many such images into hieroglyphic signs, preserving ancient-looking forms long after building practices change. But a hieroglyph is not a photograph. The resemblance between a later shrine sign and an early reed building may indicate cultural memory without allowing exact reconstruction. This is where later religious echoes become useful and dangerous at the same time. Historical Egyptian temples preserve traditions of sacred huts, primeval mounds, reed shelters, and local sanctuaries. Some divine shrines are represented in forms that appear deliberately archaic, as if their authority depends on belonging to the beginning of time. Later priests repeatedly rebuild temples while claiming that the plan follows an original divine pattern. Such claims may contain memories of early architectural forms, but they also serve the needs of later institutions. A temple of the New Kingdom can imagine its origin in prehistory without providing an objective record of what a predynastic sanctuary looked like. The earliest cult image is equally elusive. Later temples center on a divine statue housed in a restricted sanctuary, awakened, clothed, fed, and carried during festivals. Prehistoric ritual spaces may have contained carved figures, decorated poles, animal emblems, unusual stones, bundled materials, or objects that left no recognizable remains. A naturally shaped stone could hold meaning without modification. Feathers, skins, plants, and pigments may have transformed a simple structure into a powerful visual environment. Archaeologists tend to recover what resists decay, which means stone and pottery dominate the evidence even when perishable materials dominated the experience. Deposits made beneath floors, inside pits, or near entrances suggest that buildings themselves could be ritually founded or closed. Broken objects are not always refuse. Vessels may be deliberately smashed after use. Food remains placed in selected locations, and valuable items removed from ordinary circulation. The difficulty lies in distinguishing ceremonial deposition from the debris of repeated occupation. Context becomes crucial. An isolated object proves little. A structured pattern of objects, architecture, and repeated activity is more persuasive. Even then, the meaning remains partly inaccessible. Shrines also change the geography of belief. A mobile sacred object can travel with a community, but a built sanctuary gives power an address. People must approach it. Paths converge, offerings accumulate. Specialists may emerge to maintain the structure, remember the correct actions, and regulate access. The place can outlive individual leaders, allowing authority to become institutional rather than purely personal. When groups compete, control of such a center can become as important as control of pasture, river access, or exchange routes. Across the Nile Valley and Delta, these sacred addresses begin as local institutions. One community gathers around a falcon emblem, another around a bovine power, a serpent, a desert god, an ancestral figure, or a form whose name has vanished entirely. Some cults will disappear, others will merge, change names, or be absorbed into expanding political systems. A few will become famous enough to shape Egyptian religion for 3,000 years. Their survival will depend not only on theology, but on the fortunes of the towns that carry them. As villages grow into regional centers, the gods or the sacred powers becoming gods begin to gather around places with names. Once sacred power has an address, geography begins to shape theology. A community approaching a local enclosure, cemetery, or shrine does not encounter religion as an abstract system shared uniformly from the delta to the first cataract. It encounters the power of this place, the being connected to this stretch of river, this desert opening, this marsh, this ancestral burial ground, this town. Later, Egyptians will live within a pantheon containing hundreds of named deities, but that apparent unity conceals strong local roots. The same god can possess different titles and forms in different regions. Separate gods can merge when their cults meet. A deity important in one town may remain almost unknown elsewhere until political fortune carries that town's influence across the country. Nekhen, known to later Greek writers as Hierakonpolis, rises in Upper Egypt as one of the most important predynastic centers. Its cemeteries, craft areas, ceremonial enclosure, rock art, animal deposits, and elite architecture reveal a community experimenting with sacred display and concentrated authority. In historical times, Nekhen is closely associated with Horus, and the falcon becomes central to the royal identity. Yet the earliest phases remain difficult to label. Falcon imagery appears within the broader visual world of predynastic Egypt, but the name Horus is not securely attached to every early example. What can be said is that Nekhen provides the political and ceremonial environment in which falcon symbolism becomes increasingly powerful. Across the river lies Elkab, later associated with the vulture goddess Nekhbet. In dynastic religion, Nekhbet becomes a guardian of Upper Egypt and a protector of the king, often paired with the cobra goddess Wadjet of Lower Egypt. Their pairing produces one of the most enduring expressions of Egyptian unity, two female divine powers representing the two lands while jointly protecting one ruler. But this neat symmetry belongs to the state that emerges after unification. Before it, Nekhbet and Wadjet likely grow from distinct local traditions. Political theology does not invent them from nothing. It takes regional powers and places them into a new relationship. Farther north in Upper Egypt, Naqada occupies another crucial position. Its ancient name, Nubt, is associated in later periods with Seth, a deity whose character becomes increasingly complex and often hostile in the best-known myths. Yet Seth is never merely a god of evil. He embodies desert, storm, foreign lands, physical force, disruption, and the dangerous power needed to defend the solar order. His later cult history includes both royal favour and suppression. Connecting every predynastic image from Naqada to Seth would be unjustified, especially because the strange animal used to represent him has no certain identification in nature. Still, the region's later association preserves the broader pattern. Local identity and divine identity become mutually reinforcing. Naqada also gives its modern archaeological name to a sequence of material cultures spanning much of the 4th millennium BCE. That naming can create the impression that one town simply exported a complete culture across Egypt. The reality is more complicated. Pottery styles, burial customs, prestige goods, imagery, and technologies spread through interaction, competition, migration, alliance, and emulation. Local variations persist. As Naqada-related material becomes widespread, it creates a shared visual language without erasing every regional tradition. Religion likely follows a comparable process. Communities adopt recognizable symbols while continuing to interpret them through local memories. Abydos becomes one of the most enduring sacred landscapes in Egypt. Its ancient name is Abju, and its desert cemetery at el-Kab contains the tombs of late predynastic rulers and kings of the first dynasty. Long before the great Osiris festivals of historical times, the place is already tied to elite burial and ancestral authority. The earliest important deity associated with the region appears to have been Khentiamentiu, whose name refers to the foremost of the Westerners, meaning the dead. He is often represented in canid form and connected with the Western necropolis. Osiris later absorbs or overlaps with aspects of this local funerary power, and Abydos becomes his principal cult center. This transformation is a crucial reminder that even famous gods have histories. Osiris does not simply arrive complete at the beginning of Egypt. His prominence grows through the merging of local theology, royal burial traditions, and changing ideas about the afterlife. The delta contains an equally rich but less visible sacred geography. Thick alluvial deposits, shifting river branches, later settlement, agriculture, and high groundwater have obscured much of its predynastic record. Nevertheless, Communities there developed their own centers and connections. The place later called Buto grew from settlements associated with Pe and Dep in the northwestern delta. It becomes closely linked with Wadjet, the cobra goddess who protects Lower Egypt and eventually appears on the royal brow. Her later role in national kingship does not erase her delta identity, it elevates it. Other delta centers will become associated with deities such as Neith at Sais, and Jeti at Busiris, and Atum and Ra at Heliopolis. The earlier secure evidence for each cult differs, and later temple traditions often claim origins much older than archaeology can verify. Those claims served important purposes. Antiquity granted authority. A town whose god existed at creation could present itself as essential to the cosmic order. Priests could preserve, revise, or invent genealogies connecting local worship to the beginning of time. The older a cult appeared, the stronger its claim to land, offerings, royal attention, and prestige. The process does not mean that religion is merely politics wearing an animal mask. Local gods matter because communities experience places as distinct. The marshes of the delta do not resemble the desert margins of Upper Egypt. A town near a cataract encounters the river differently from one surrounded by branching channels. Agricultural cycles, dangerous species, trade routes, mineral access, neighbouring populations, and ancestral cemeteries all shape the qualities attributed to sacred powers. Political competition then amplifies those differences. A successful town can carry its divine patron into wider networks, while a defeated or absorbed community may see its deity subordinated, merged, reinterpreted, or quietly maintained at home. Standards visible on predynastic and early dynastic objects may reflect this world of local identities. Animal emblems and other signs are carried on poles in scenes of procession and royal display. Later readers sometimes identify them directly with administrative districts known as nomes, but the development of those territorial units is not fully clear. The standards may represent communities, cults, military followers, sacred powers, or combinations of all four. What survives in the record suggests that political groups were learning to present themselves through emblematic forms. To march beneath a standard is to make collective identity visible. To gather many standards around one ruler is to claim that many local powers now acknowledge a common centre. That common centre remains unstable during the late 4th millennium BCE. Hierakonpolis, Nakada, and Abydos all participate in expanding networks of elite authority. In the north, Buto, Tel el-Faka, Tel el-Iswid, and other delta sites reveal their own trajectories. The formation of Egypt is not adequately explained by a simple picture of civilized southerners overwhelming an empty or passive north. Trade, settlement change, elite competition, and cultural blending unfold before and during political consolidation. There may have been conflict, but unification is a process rather than a single victorious moment. The gods make that process easier to imagine. A ruler who controls several regions cannot rely only on physical presence. The Nile Valley is too long, and local loyalties are too deeply rooted. He must present his authority as compatible with the sacred powers of each place. One solution is not to destroy local gods, but to honour them, link them to royal ritual, and place them within a wider hierarchy. A local deity can remain protector of a town while also becoming guardian of the king, or member of a divine family recognized elsewhere. This flexibility will become one of the great strengths of Egyptian religion. Contradictory traditions can coexist because sacred truth is expressed through many forms rather than reduced to a single exclusive creed. Such flexibility also preserves older layers. Khentimentu can merge with Osiris without disappearing entirely. Wadjet and Nekhbet can remain distinct while acting together. Seth can oppose Horus in myth, yet also protect the solar god in other traditions. Local creation stories can disagree about which deity came first, and each temple can still regard its own version as true. Egyptian religion grows by accumulation. It rarely discards a powerful symbol when it can reinterpret it. Among all these local powers, however, one relationship becomes especially important to the emerging state. At Nekhen and within the expanding culture of Upper Egyptian rulership, the falcon moves closer to the human leader. It appears above, beside, and eventually within the identity of the king. What began as a creature of height and predatory vision becomes the form through which political authority claims the sky itself. The question is no longer only which god protects a town. It is how a ruler comes to be presented as the living embodiment of divine power and why the falcon is chosen to rise above him. The falcon's ascent from a powerful creature to the defining emblem of Egyptian kingship leaves no single moment of transformation. There is no surviving inscription announcing that a local bird has become a national god. Instead, the change appears through increasingly deliberate associations. Falcons occur in predynastic imagery among many other animals, but during the late 4th millennium BCE they begin to occupy positions that are difficult to dismiss as decorative. They stand above standards, accompany commanding figures, and appear in compositions concerned with territory, dominance, and ritual authority. Their natural qualities already make them suitable for such a role. A falcon sees from above, moves between earth and sky, and strikes with speed. Political symbolism takes those qualities and turns them into a claim the ruler, too, sees the land from a height unavailable to ordinary people. Nekhen provides the setting in which this claim becomes especially powerful. The town's later identity is closely bound to Horus, and royal ceremonies continue to remember Hierakonpolis long after political power shifts elsewhere. Yet archaeology must move carefully across the gap between later cult and earlier image. A falcon carved or painted at Nekhen before writing becomes widespread, maybe ancestral to Horus symbolism, but its name cannot be recovered merely from its shape. Scholars still debate when it becomes appropriate to call the earliest falcon figures Horus, rather than simply falcon emblems. What matters is that, by the time royal names begin to appear clearly, the connection between falcon and king is no longer vague. It has become one of the central statements of the emerging state. Some of the most famous objects were discovered in what is known as the main deposit at Hierakonpolis. Among them are the Nama palette and the ceremonial mace head associated with the ruler conventionally called Scorpion. These objects were deposited in a temple context long after, or perhaps as part of ceremonial use, but the exact history of the deposit remains debated. They are not straightforward snapshots of events. Their imagery compresses ritual, ideology, and political memory into carefully organized scenes. The ruler appears larger than other figures, wears crowns associated with different regions, performs acts of domination, and moves through a world ordered by standards and attendants. The falcon participates in this visual system as something more than a companion animal. It embodies the sacred authority through which conquest is presented as legitimate order. On the Nama palette, a falcon stands above a cluster of papyrus plants and controls a human-headed form. The scene is often interpreted as the ruler's mastery over Lower Egypt because papyrus is associated with the delta, and a group of papyrus stalks may carry a numerical or territorial meaning. The exact reading remains disputed, and modern certainty can exceed what the object actually tells us. Still, The falcon clearly acts on the ruler's side. It does not merely observe. Its power extends the king's power into a divine register, making political subordination appear to be sanctioned from above. The most revealing royal device is smaller and, at first glance, less dramatic. Early kings place one of their names inside a rectangular frame called a serek. The lower part resembles the patterned facade of a palace or elite building. Above it stands a falcon. The arrangement creates an entire theory of kingship in compact form. The human ruler's name occupies the architectural domain below, while the falcon stands over it as divine presence, protector, or identity. The king is located within the palace and beneath the god, yet he is also inseparable from the god whose form crowns his name. This is the Horus name, the earliest of the royal titles that will later expand into the full pharaonic titulary. The Seres also solves a political problem. A ruler cannot be physically present in every settlement, storehouse, workshop, or burial ground. His name and emblem can, placed on ceilings, pottery, labels, vessels, and other objects. The royal sign travels through administrative networks. It marks ownership, production, allegiance, or authority. Wherever the serek appears, the palace and falcon appear with it. Writing does not simply record government after government exists. It helps make distant rule visible. The divine symbol gives that visibility a sacred force. To handle a container bearing the royal name is to encounter a miniature image of the political order. Several late predynastic and early dynastic rulers are known primarily through such signs. Their precise sequence, territory, and relationships remain subjects of continuing research. Names conventionally read as Ka, Iri Hor, Nama, and others appear in contexts linking Upper Egypt, the Delta, desert routes, and trading zones beyond Egypt. The evidence suggests expanding reach, but it does not always reveal whether that reach came through conquest, alliance, exchange, seasonal control, or some combination. The falcon above the serek presents the result as unified authority, even when the historical process beneath it was probably uneven. Horus himself will not remain a single, simple figure. Egyptian religion develops many falcon gods and many forms of Horus, associated with the sky, kingship, particular towns, the horizon, solar power, and later the mythic son of Osiris and Isis. Traditions overlap. Horus can be an ancient celestial power whose eyes are sun and moon, a local god of Nekhen, a royal protector, and the rightful heir who defeats Seth. These forms do not fit neatly into one chronological biography. Egyptian theology often preserves several identities simultaneously, allowing local and national meanings to coexist. This complexity makes popular stories of gods ruling Egypt before humans especially misleading. The Horus of later mythology is not evidence that a being called Horus once sat on a prehistoric throne. The archaeological record shows a more credible and more fascinating development. Human rulers adopt a falcon-linked divine identity as political communities expand. Later theologians place that identity inside narratives of cosmic succession. Still later, king lists arrange gods, spirits, and human kings into a continuous sequence reaching back to creation. Myth reverses the historical process instead of kingship helping to shape the public form of Horus. Horus appears as the original king from whom human kings inherit power. For the emerging ruler, association with the falcon offers both elevation and continuity. Individual leaders die, but Horus does not. Each new king can become the living Horus, occupying an office that exceeds personal biography. The sacred identity passes from one human body to another while the institution remains. This principle will become essential to the durability of Egyptian kingship. A failed ruler does not necessarily invalidate divine monarchy. The next ruler restores the proper relationship. The god provides a permanent form into which temporary humans enter. The falcon also joins land and sky. The king governs cultivated territory, commands labor, receives goods, and controls roots. But his image places those practical powers beneath a celestial being. Political administration becomes part of a larger order. The ruler's dominance is no longer only the success of one regional elite over another. It is portrayed as the correct arrangement of the world. Enemies become signs of disorder. Royal victory becomes restoration, and territorial control becomes a sacred responsibility. The full ideology of cosmic order will develop over centuries, but the visual foundation is already present when the falcon stands above the palace facade. Nekhen's importance therefore survives even after Abydos becomes the principal royal burial ground, and Memphis emerges near the junction of the valley and delta as a center of the United State. The town remains a place of origin and political memory. Its god has traveled farther than its immediate territory, yet he carries that local ancestry with him. Egyptian religion repeatedly works this way. National power does not erase the place where a god first became important. It magnifies the place and folds it into a larger sacred map. The falcon's victory is not exclusive. However, royal power must also express birth, continuity, protection, fertility, and the vastness of the sky as a sustaining enclosure. Those qualities gather around other forms, especially cattle and powerful female divinities. Horns curve around the sun. The king is nourished, protected, and symbolically born through celestial motherhood. If the falcon raises kingship above the land, bovine and maternal powers give it a lineage and connect the ruler to a sky imagined not only as height, but as a living body capable of bringing forth the sun. The sky imagined as a living body does not begin with a written myth. It begins with observation. A cow stands above the ground on 4 legs, her body forming a broad shelter beneath which life can be nourished. Her horns curve outward and upward, creating a natural frame around the space between them. When later Egyptian artists place the sun disk between bovine horns, the image appears so perfectly resolved that it can seem timeless. Yet it is the result of a long symbolic development. Predynastic cattle imagery is abundant, but the names and personalities of the great bovine goddesses emerge only gradually. The cow comes first in the surviving visual record. The theology explaining her celestial and maternal power comes later. For communities shaped by herding, cattle carry practical and social weight. They provide milk, hides, meat, horn, and living wealth. They require pasture and water, linking their condition directly to rainfall, flood, and human planning. A healthy herd reflects successful knowledge and cooperation. Cattle can be exchanged, displayed, counted, inherited, and gathered for communal ceremonies. Their size makes them impressive. Their dependence on care makes them intimate. Unlike a crocodile or falcon, a cow lives within the managed human world while retaining physical power far beyond that of an individual person. This combination of strength, nourishment, and familiarity makes bovine form unusually flexible as a sacred symbol. The cow's maternal associations seem obvious, but obvious meanings can still mislead. Milk sustains life, and the bond between cow and calf provides a visible model of protection and nourishment. Later Egyptian texts and images will use divine milk to legitimize kingship. A goddess nurses the ruler, making his authority not merely political but bodily connected to the divine. Yet predynastic images of cattle cannot automatically be read as scenes of a mother goddess. A bovine figure may signify wealth, territory, a herd, a ceremonial animal, celestial power, or elite control. Gender itself is not always clear in stylized images. Archaeology preserves forms more readily than the stories that once made those forms specific. This problem is especially visible on the Nama palette. At the top of both sides, a human-like face with bovine ears and curving horns looks outward from the ceremonial object. Earlier interpretations often identified the figure as Hathor, one of the most important goddesses of later Egypt. Other scholars have argued that it is more likely Bat, an ancient bovine goddess associated with the region of Upper Egypt. Still, others prefer a cautious description such as bovine deity, because the image lacks a written label that would settle the matter. The uncertainty is not a minor academic disagreement. It reveals how easily later fame can be projected backward. Hathor becomes so prominent that she tends to absorb every early cow image in modern imagination, just as Horus tends to absorb every early falcon. Bat is less familiar today, partly because her identity later overlaps with Hathor. She's associated with the seventh nome of Upper Egypt and can be represented with a frontal human face, bovine ears, and inward curving horns. Her emblem appears connected with the sistrum, a ritual instrument whose sound becomes especially important in the worship of Hathor. Bat's frontal gaze is unusual within Egyptian art, which generally favours profile views for faces. On ceremonial objects, such a face can confront the viewer directly, projecting presence rather than participating in a narrative scene. Whether the Nama palette's upper faces are definitively Bat remains debated, but the possibility shows that early bovine divinity was not confined to one goddess. Hathor's own name means the house of Horus, a phrase suggesting the sky or divine enclosure within which the falcon dwells. She becomes goddess of music, celebration, love, sexuality, motherhood, foreign lands, precious materials, the Western necropolis, and the welcoming of the dead. She can appear as a cow, a woman with bovine ears, or a woman wearing horns and a sun disk. No single English label captures her range. To call her only a mother goddess is to reduce a power who links royal birth, celestial space, joy, danger, and death. But her fully documented identity belongs to dynastic Egypt. Her earliest development remains difficult to reconstruct, and scholars still debate how much derives from older bovine cults, including traditions related to Bat. Other cow goddesses further complicate the picture. Mehet-Weret, whose name refers to the Great Flood, is represented as a celestial cow associated with primeval waters and the birth of the sun. Nut, more commonly shown as a woman arching over the earth, can also take bovine form. In later funerary compositions, the sky cow lifts the solar deity and supports the ordered cosmos. These traditions resonate strongly with the Nile environment. Water, birth, rising light, and the body of a female divine being become parts of one image. Yet resonance is not proof of direct survival from early herding communities. Egyptian priests were skilled at connecting existing symbols into elaborate theological systems. The cow's prehistoric importance offered rich material, but later thought reorganized that material repeatedly. Female figurines from predynastic contexts have also been drawn into stories about a universal mother goddess. Some possess emphasized bodily features, others raise their arms in poses sometimes compared with later divine imagery. They may represent women, dancers, ancestors, ritual specialists, fertility, identity, or beings whose categories are no longer recoverable. Calling all of them mother goddesses creates an answer where the evidence offers possibilities. It also encourages unsupported claims that prehistoric Egypt was ruled by a single goddess religion or a matriarchal priesthood. No surviving record demonstrates such a system. Female sacred power is clearly important, but importance does not require one universal cult or one social structure. The later pantheon preserves many distinct forms of female authority. Nekhbet and Wadjet protect the king and represent Upper and Lower Egypt. Neith is linked with creation, weaving, hunting, and warfare. Isis becomes the model of royal motherhood, magical skill, mourning, protection, and legitimate succession. Sekhmet embodies solar ferocity and healing. Hathor holds joy and dangerous rage within the same divine identity. These goddesses cannot all be reduced to fertility, and their diversity likely reflects the absorption of many local traditions into national religion. Predynastic bovine imagery belong within that wider process of differentiation. Royal symbolism benefits enormously from maternal divinity. The falcon establishes the king as a power above the land. The goddess gives him divine origin, nourishment, and protection. This does not make queens or women politically irrelevant. Elite women hold significant roles from the earliest dynasties, but divine motherhood serves the institution of kingship more broadly. The ruler can be born from a goddess regardless of the identity of his human mother. His legitimacy is placed inside a cosmic genealogy. Political succession becomes a family relationship among divine powers. Bovine imagery also helps define the heavens. Horns can carry the sun disk without enclosing it completely. The solar orb appears protected, supported, and repeatedly born. The sky is not empty distance, but a maternal realm through which light travels. Later temples will celebrate the sun's daily emergence from a goddess, and funerary religion will imagine the deceased entering her body to be renewed. These ideas transform the ancient contrast between natural recurrence and human mortality into a sacred promise. What enters darkness may be carried toward another dawn. Yet the cow is not always gentle. Hathor can become the Eye of Ra, a force of devastating solar anger, and bovine power can be royal, aggressive, and overwhelming. Bulls symbolize potency and domination. The king may be shown as a strong bull. Maternal protection itself can be fierce. Egyptian religion refuses the modern habit of separating nurturing from dangerous power. The being capable of sustaining life is also capable of defending it. This union of protection and threat leads back to the landscape from which the symbols emerged. The cultivated valley survives only because boundaries hold water must rise but not overwhelm. Herds must be protected, fields must remain fertile, the dead must be separated yet remembered, and distant regions must be connected without dissolving local identity. Beyond those boundaries stand desert, flood, darkness, dangerous animals, and rival powers. Egyptian sacred thought will not imagine chaos as mere emptiness. It gives chaos bodies, habitats, and names, and then asks how a fragile world can keep it at the edge without ever fully destroying it. The edge of cultivation is not a clean boundary between good and evil. It is a place of exchange, uncertainty, and sudden reversal. Beyond the last irrigated ground lie desert routes leading to stone, metals, pigments, shells, animals, and distant communities. The desert can preserve the dead, shelter travelers, and provide the raw materials from which sacred objects are made. It can also disorient, exhaust, and conceal. The river nourishes fields, carries boats, and supplies fish. but it can overrun banks or fail to rise enough. Darkness brings rest and cool air, yet it also removes the certainty provided by sight. Egyptian ideas of disorder emerge from these contradictions. Chaos is not simply somewhere outside the world. It is the possibility that familiar relationships may cease to hold. Later Egyptians give this opposition a formal language. Maat represents truth, balance, rightful order, justice, proper relationship, and the patterned stability on which life depends. Isfet represents falsehood, disruption, injustice, and disorder. These terms belong to the literate religious and political system of dynastic Egypt, and there is no evidence that prehistoric Nile communities used them in the same articulated way. Still, the environmental and social experience behind the contrast is ancient. A dependable flood, a maintained boundary, an honoured agreement, a properly conducted burial, and a successful seasonal gathering all preserve continuity. Failed obligations, unpredictable water, broken alliances, and uncontrolled power threaten it. Order, however, is never achieved once and permanently secured. This is one of the deepest characteristics of Egyptian sacred thought. The sun rises each morning, but its return must happen again tomorrow. The Nile floods, but the next inundation remains uncertain. A king establishes authority, but succession can fail. A body is buried correctly, but memory can fade and offerings can stop. Later rituals, therefore, do not merely celebrate an already perfect universe. They help renew a universe that must continually resist disintegration. Repetition is not empty habit, it is maintenance. The night sky offers the clearest cosmic image of this struggle. In later mythology, the solar god travels through the hidden world after sunset and faces the great serpent often called Apophis, or Apep, who threatens the solar boat and the continuation of creation. Each dawn signals another victory, but the serpent is never eliminated forever. It returns because the danger of a non-order remains part of existence. The prehistoric roots of this story cannot be traced in a direct line, and early serpent images should not automatically be labelled Apophis. Yet the myth gives theological form to an observation already familiar. Beside the Nile, darkness regularly consumes the sun, and the world depends on its return. Floodwater carries a similar ambiguity. Later creation traditions imagine the ordered world emerging from primeval waters, often called Nun. A first mound rises, allowing creation to begin. The image reflects more than an annual river event, but the inundation makes its logic visible. When water covers the low floodplain, landmarks disappear. As it withdraws, earth emerges again. The field seems newly created from a watery expanse. Still, the annual flood is not identical to the cosmic ocean, and no predynastic text survives to connect them. What can safely be said is that the Nile Valley offers repeated scenes in which formed land emerges from formless water, making creation understandable as a process rather than a distant event. The desert provides the opposite image, not too much water, but its absence. Later theology often links Seth with desert, storm, foreign lands, and disruptive strength. His conflict with Horus becomes one of Egypt's central myths, especially in stories surrounding kingship and the succession of Osiris. But Seth is not a simple devil. He can defend the solar god against Apophis, using his violent strength on behalf of cosmic survival. Some kings honour him prominently, and his cult remains important in several periods. The same power that threatens settled order can be recruited to protect it. Egyptian religion repeatedly contains danger by assigning it a legitimate role. This principle appears in protective imagery. Creatures feared in ordinary life can guard sacred spaces, royal bodies, houses, and the dead. The cobra becomes the uraeus on the king's brow, ready to repel threats. Lion forms guard thresholds. Hippopotamus powers can protect as well as endanger. Knives, wands, amulets, and ritual images call upon fierce beings precisely because gentleness is not enough against hostile forces. Protection does not require the removal of danger. It requires danger to be turned in the correct direction. Political imagery follows the same logic. Predynastic and early dynastic rulers are shown dominating opponents, controlling animals, and presiding over orderly processions. The famous royal smiting pose, in which a ruler raises a weapon over a subdued enemy, will remain in Egyptian art for millennia. Such scenes should not always be read as literal records of individual battles. They are ideological images of restored hierarchy. The king appears larger than everyone else. Enemies are reduced to types, and disorder is condensed into a figure that can be controlled. The image promises that the ruler can do politically what the gods do, cosmically keep destabilizing forces beneath rightful authority. This does not mean that Egypt's neighbors truly embodied chaos. Nubians, Libyans, Levantine peoples, desert pastoralists, and delta communities are real populations with complex relationships to the Nile Valley. They trade, migrate, intermarry, serve in institutions, resist expansion, and influence Egyptian culture. Royal ideology can transform a political rival into a symbolic enemy without describing everyday reality. The same state that depicts foreigners as defeated may depend on foreign goods, specialists, soldiers, and diplomatic partners. Order is being narrated from the center, and the center has a habit of making itself look indispensable. The distinction between center and edge also changes over time. A town once considered peripheral can become a capital. A foreign deity can enter the Egyptian pantheon. A desert route can become essential to royal wealth. A local opponent can be incorporated into the administration. Egyptian order is not fixed geography. It is a flexible political claim. The pharaoh stands at the imagined center, while everything placed beyond his control risks being described as disorder. Yet successful rule requires continuous engagement with those supposedly dangerous margins. The Nile itself makes total isolation impossible. Its water arrives from outside Egypt. Trade routes cross the eastern and western deserts. Gold, incense, timber, oils, copper, ivory, animals, and ideas enter from lands beyond the valley. Even the materials used to represent divine order testify to international and regional exchange. The state cannot simply seal the border between cosmos and chaos. It must manage movement across it. Ritual, administration, diplomacy, and military display become different methods for controlling that passage. At the personal level, disorder is equally close. Illness, infertility, failed harvests, disputes, dangerous animals, and unsettling dreams do not belong only to national mythology. Later Egyptians used prayers, amulets, spells, offerings, and household rituals to negotiate these uncertainties. The earliest evidence for such practices is fragmentary because many objects are perishable, and many actions leave no trace. Still, the logic of protective material culture appears early. Pigments, animal forms, carved combs, palettes, decorated vessels, and carefully selected stones can carry meanings beyond utility. An object held, worn, displayed, or buried becomes a point where invisible danger can be addressed through visible action. The emerging ruler claims the greatest responsibility for this work, but he does not invent it. Communities already use boundaries, offerings, burials, gatherings, and animal symbols to sustain proper relationships. Kingship enlarges those practices and places them within a national performance. The ruler contains wild animals, defeats enemies, presents offerings, and aligns himself with gods because these acts demonstrate that the world remains ordered around him. His authority depends on making uncertainty appear manageable. Yet the objects carrying that message rarely explain themselves. A palette may show entwined creatures no one can identify securely. A mace head may combine census, festival, agriculture, or conquest in one compressed scene. A standard may signify a god, town, political faction, or all at once. These are the surviving fragments from which the birth of divine kingship must be reconstructed. They stand between prehistory and writing, filled with images that seem almost readable while withholding their final meaning. In them, chaos is not only represented, it survives as uncertainty in the evidence itself. The surviving objects do not speak, but they are not silent. They communicate through scale, material, placement, repetition, and the labor required to make them. A ceremonial palette too large and elaborate for ordinary cosmetic use announces that a familiar object has crossed into another category. A mace head carved with tiny processions is no longer merely a weapon or tool. An ivory label attached to a container can connect goods, places, institutions, and royal authority. A standard carried above a crowd turns identity into a visible sign. These objects stand at the threshold between image and writing, where meaning is becoming organized but has not yet become easy to read. One of the earliest great visual archives lies in the decorated tomb known as Tomb 100 at Hierakonpolis, dating to the 4th millennium BCE. Its painted plaster walls contain boats, animals, human figures, and scenes of dominance or ceremony arranged without the rigid registers familiar from later Egyptian art. The boats are especially important. They may evoke river travel, procession, elite display, trade, funerary movement, or sacred journeys. Some motifs resemble imagery found on pottery, while others anticipate themes that later become royal. A commanding figure appears in a pose often compared with the later ruler striking an enemy. Another figure stands between powerful animals in a composition with parallels in Western Asian art. The tomb is not a simple storyboard. It is a concentrated field of elite symbols whose exact narrative remains unknown. Its foreign-looking motifs reveal that early Egypt develops within a connected world. During the late 4th millennium BCE, objects and ideas move between Egypt, the Levant, Mesopotamia, Nubia, and desert regions, cylinder seals, artistic conventions, materials, vessel forms, and perhaps administrative practices cross long distances. The famous ivory handle of the Gebel el Arak knife shows a figure controlling 2 lions in a style strongly associated with Mesopotamian imagery, while other scenes involve boats and conflict. Whether the object was made in Egypt by craftspeople familiar with foreign motifs or arrived through another route remains debated. Either way, Egyptian elites do not merely copy, they select imagery and place it inside local objects whose meanings continue to evolve. This matters because later Egyptian art appears extraordinarily distinctive. Its conventions of scale, profile, register, and royal posture become so stable that they can seem isolated from external influence. Predynastic objects reveal the experimental period before those conventions settle. Long-necked creatures twist into circular frames. Animals form rows that may represent control, abundance, or exotic reach. Human figures vary dramatically in size. Boats carry standards whose identities are only partly recoverable. Artists are discovering how to organize political and sacred power on a small surface. Ceremonial palettes provide some of the richest evidence. Smaller palettes were used to grind pigments, including minerals applied around the eyes. As palettes grow larger and more ornate, their practical origin remains visible in the central grinding area, even when actual use becomes doubtful. The object retains the memory of bodily preparation while becoming a public monument. This transformation may itself carry meaning. Pigment protects, adorns, and changes appearance. The ceremonial palette turns that intimate act into a surface for transforming political events into sacred order. The hunter's palette shows organized figures pursuing wild animals, carrying bows, spears, standards, and other equipment. The scene may commemorate a hunt, represent elite cooperation, dramatize control of the desert, or encode a ritual performance. The animals do not appear randomly. They occupy a composition in which human coordination confronts wild power. The two dogs' palette surrounds a recessed center with creatures both real and fantastic, including long-necked animals whose intertwined bodies form a controlled boundary. Such images suggest that order can be created by arranging the dangerous and extraordinary into a balanced design. The Nama palette brings this visual language close to its classical form. The ruler dominates the scale, wears different crowns, inspects ordered bodies, confronts an opponent, and appears as a powerful bull breaking through an enclosure. Two fantastical, long-necked creatures are restrained so that their necks create the central circle. The scene gathers human, animal, architectural, and divine symbols into a statement of authority. It is often called a record of the unification of Egypt, but that description is too certain. It may commemorate a campaign, a ritual of kingship, a recurring claim over Lower Egypt, or an idealized union already in progress. What it demonstrates beyond doubt is that royal power is being represented as the force capable of arranging the entire visible world. Mace heads carry related claims. The ceremonial object associated with King Scorpion shows a ruler wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt and holding a hoe near a channel or field. He may be opening an irrigation canal, performing an agricultural foundation rite, or participating in a festival whose details are lost. Standards and attendants surround him, while other signs suggest landscape, plants, and political identity. The image is striking because it links kingship not only to domination but to cultivation. The ruler makes the land productive, or at least claims ceremonial responsibility for doing so. Authority is presented as the management of water and fertility. The Nama macehead is even harder to interpret. It shows the king beneath a canopy, figures approaching, standards, enclosures, and large numerical signs that may record quantities of people, animals, or goods. Scholars have proposed a royal marriage, a jubilee-like ceremony, tribute, victory celebration, or census. No single explanation fully accounts for every element. Yet the underlying message is consistent resources and communities flow toward the enthroned ruler, whose presence organizes the scene. Ivory and bone labels from late Predynastic and early dynastic context reveal another revolution. At Abydos, tomb UG, dating to around the late 4th millennium BCE, small inscribed tags were found in association with containers and valuable goods. They belong among the earliest evidence for writing in Egypt. The signs may identify places, institutions, products, quantities, or royal domains. They are not theological books, and they do not reveal complete myths about the gods. Their importance lies in showing that administration, ritual deposition, and symbolic notation develop together. Writing emerges partly because concentrated authority needs to track movement, ownership, and origin. A jar of oil or wine is perishable. A label can preserve its association. A ruler dies. His signs can continue to identify the estate or institution connected to him. Names make power portable across distance and potentially durable across time. When divine emblems enter this system, gods also become more fixed. A falcon accompanied by phonetic or contextual signs can be distinguished from an unidentified bird. A local sacred form gains a written name that can travel beyond its home. Writing does not create the god, but it narrows ambiguity and makes institutional worship easier to administer. Standards occupy the space between picture and sign. An animal, plant, or object mounted on a pole can lead a procession, mark a group, and represent an invisible power. On ceremonial artifacts, standards often appear near rulers, as though communities and deities have assembled under royal direction. Later administrative district will possess emblematic signs, but the route from early standards to formal nomes is uncertain. The same emblem may shift from clan or cult identity toward territorial administration. Political organization grows by reusing sacred forms rather than inventing an entirely separate language. Depositional context adds a final layer. Many ceremonial objects are discovered not where they were made or first used, but in temple deposits, tombs, or caches. The main deposit at Hierakonpolis includes prestigious artifacts that may have been preserved, displayed, and eventually buried as sacred objects. Deposition can mark retirement, dedication, renewal, or institutional memory. A damaged ritual object cannot always be thrown away like household refuse. Its power may require controlled burial. Archaeologists therefore study not only the image but the final act that removed the object from circulation. Each artifact preserves several times at once the older tradition from which its shape comes, the moment when its imagery is created, the ceremonies in which it is used, and the later decision to deposit it. This layered history explains why interpretation remains difficult. The object is evidence, but not a transparent message. It reveals that animals, towns, resources, enemies, water, and divine emblems are being drawn into a common visual order. At the center of that order, one human figure grows larger with every generation. The ruler is no longer merely protected by sacred power. He is becoming the person through whom sacred power acts. The ruler at the center of these objects is not yet called Pharaoh, in the way later audiences use the word. The Egyptian expression from which Pharaoh derives originally means the great house, and becomes a regular designation for the king only much later. Calling Nama or Aha a pharaoh is convenient modern shorthand, but it can hide how experimental their institution still is. Around 3100 BCE, kingship has already acquired formidable sacred imagery, administrative reach, and ceremonial authority. Yet the system later taken for granted is still being assembled from regional traditions, personal rule, household organization, cult practice, and control of the Nile corridor. Late predynastic rulers emerge from a landscape containing several powerful centers rather than one natural capital. Hierakonpolis, Nakada, and Abydos each participate in the development of elite authority in Upper Egypt, while delta communities maintain their own networks and institutions. Over time, royal power becomes increasingly associated with Abydos, where large tombs at el-Kab preserve the names and possessions of rulers whose influence extends far beyond one town. Some belong to what modern historians call Dynasty Zero, a useful but artificial label for kings before the conventional First Dynasty. Their exact sequence remains debated because evidence comes from fragmentary inscriptions, sealings, pottery, tomb contents, and objects found far from their original settings. These rulers do more than command followers. They gather materials from different regions, sponsor specialized production, control storage and redistribution, organize expeditions, and maintain networks of officials. Valuable goods move toward royal tombs: wine, oils, stone vessels, ivory, copper, timber, textiles, and crafted objects. Each item represents relationships extending through villages, workshops, routes, and foreign contacts. The tomb at Abydos is therefore not only a burial place, it is the visible endpoint of an administrative system capable of concentrating wealth around one person and continuing to serve that person after death. Sacred authority makes such concentration appear meaningful rather than arbitrary. The king is linked with the Horus falcon, protected by divine powers and represented as the one who controls wildness, enemies, water, and abundance. Ceremonial scenes show him larger than everyone else because scale expresses rank, not physical size. Standards approach him. Captives, animals, and goods are counted beneath his authority. He opens land, performs rites, receives processions, and wears crowns whose meanings exceed ordinary clothing. The ruler is not merely wealthy. He is becoming the point where human society meets the structure of the cosmos. A recently studied rock art panel on the West Bank near Aswan offers another glimpse of this transition. Its imagery includes a boat, a commanding figure, and symbols of authority dating to the proto-early dynastic era. The precise identity of the figure remains uncertain, and the panel cannot be securely assigned to a named ruler. Yet it shows royal-looking imagery appearing near the southern approaches of Egypt, close to routes connecting Upper Egypt and Nubia. Authority is being carved into landscape beyond the principal cemeteries and ceremonial centers. The ruler's image travels along boundaries, trade corridors, and places where power must be made visible. Boats are essential to that visibility. A royal procession moving along the Nile can bring the ruler attendants, standards, sacred objects, and supplies into direct contact with distant communities. The journey is practical administration and theatrical display at once. People see the scale of the royal household and the diversity of emblems gathered around it. Local leaders present goods, renew loyalty, or negotiate their place within the expanding system. A boat can also become a sacred vessel, carrying divine presence or royal identity through a landscape ordered by the river. Later Egyptian festivals will make processional boats central to relations between gods, kings, and towns. Their predynastic prominence shows that political integration was imagined through movement long before roads could bind the valley together. Crowns perform a similar work. The white crown becomes associated with Upper Egypt and the red crown with Lower Egypt, while the combined double crown expresses rule over both lands. The earliest origins of these forms are not completely understood, and their regional meanings may have developed over time. On the Nama palette, the ruler wears different crowns on opposite faces, creating one of the most famous statements of dual kingship. Whether the object commemorates a single final conquest cannot be established. Unification likely unfolds through repeated campaigns, alliances, marriages, economic integration, settlement change, and administrative expansion. The palette compresses that long instability into one ruler who appears equally legitimate in both forms. This compression is the achievement of ideology. Political history is messy, but sacred kingship presents unity as the natural condition restored by the king. Upper and Lower Egypt become the two lands, different but designed to be held together. Nekhbet and Wadjet protect the ruler jointly. Crowns combine. Regional standards gather in procession. The king's body becomes the meeting point of paired territories. What may have taken generations of competition is represented as a cosmic relationship requiring one central mediator. Narmer stands near the threshold between archaeological sequence and later historical memory. His name appears clearly on important objects, and evidence connects his reign with broad networks across Egypt. Yet the later tradition often begins unified human kingship with a figure called Menes or Meni. Scholars have long debated whether Menes should be identified with Narmer, with his successor Aha, or understood as a later composite or traditional name. No consensus fully resolves the problem. The uncertainty reminds us that Egyptian historical memory was already reshaping the beginning of kingship long before modern historians began doing the same. The early state requires continuity beyond one ruler. Royal burial and succession provide it. A king receives an exceptional tomb, goods, attendants, and commemorative rites. His successor takes the Horus identity and continues the institution. Seal impressions can list royal names in sequence, turning succession into an ordered chain. An individual death no longer threatens to dissolve authority completely, because kingship exists as a sacred office. The living ruler is the current embodiment of a pattern whose predecessors remain active through burial and cult. Administration enters this sacred pattern at every level. Containers sealed with royal names, estates linked to divine or royal institutions, officials managing goods, and scribes recording quantities may seem less mysterious than falcon gods or celestial cows. Yet they are the machinery that allows sacred kingship to function across distance. Offerings must be delivered. Tombs must be maintained. Ceremonies require grain, beer, livestock, textiles, incense, vessels, and labor. A god with a permanent cult needs an economy. A divine king needs officials who can make cosmic responsibility measurable. The system also changes the meaning of failure. A poor flood or regional disturbance is no longer only a local misfortune. It can reflect on the ruler whose role is to maintain order. The king must respond through redistribution, ritual, building, expedition, or public display. Royal ideology makes enormous claims, but those claims create enormous obligations. Kingship is sacred partly because it promises that the uncertainty of the Nile world can be managed at a scale beyond the village. This promise does not go uncontested. Local elites retain influence, regional cults retain followers, and communities do not become culturally identical after political unification. The evidence for conflict, resistance, and negotiation is fragmentary, often filtered through royal images that permit only victory. What survives suggests that early kingship succeeds not by eliminating every difference, but by placing differences inside a hierarchy. A local god can remain powerful if that power supports the king. A town can preserve its rituals while contributing goods and loyalty to the state. A regional emblem can survive by becoming part of national symbolism. The ruler therefore enters the sacred world as organizer rather than sole creator. He claims the falcon, crowns, standards, divine protection, ancestral tombs, and control of ritual. But each of these has a history older than centralized rule. His achievement is to gather them around one body and make their combination appear inevitable. The state presents political unity as cosmic necessity. Yet beneath that polished image remain many local memories. Egypt is becoming one kingdom. But it is not becoming one tradition. Its durability will depend on learning how to preserve multiplicity without allowing multiplicity to break the royal center apart. Unity does not make Egypt uniform. The new state stretches across environments, communities, and sacred landscapes that have developed separately for centuries: delta marshes, narrow Upper Egyptian floodplains, desert gateways, oases, cataract regions, and Mediterranean routes cannot be reduced to one local experience. The ruler may wear a double crown, but people still live beside particular channels, bury their dead in particular cemeteries, and approach powers associated with particular towns. The success of Egyptian religion lies partly in its refusal to demand that every local truth be replaced by one official version. A cult can enter the royal system without surrendering its home. Horus becomes the divine identity of kingship, yet remains connected with centers such as Nekhen and later Edfu. Wadjet and Nekbet are joined as protectors of the two lands, but each keeps her regional form. Khentimentu's funerary identity at Abydos overlaps with the expanding power of Osiris rather than simply vanishing. A local deity can be reinterpreted as a form, title, partner, parent, or manifestation of another. The result is not theological confusion from an Egyptian perspective. Divine power is understood as capable of taking multiple forms, and several explanations can reveal different aspects of the same reality. This flexibility helps the state absorb regional traditions. A ruler arriving at an established sanctuary does not need to declare its god false. He can offer to that god, restore the shrine, appoint or recognize local officials, and claim divine approval. The cult gains resources and royal prestige. The king gains legitimacy rooted in place. The relationship can be tense, especially when local elites control land, labor, and inherited ritual knowledge. Yet cooperation is more sustainable than constant religious replacement. Temples become points where central authority and regional identity negotiate with one another. The political process beneath this arrangement remains difficult to reconstruct. Some regions may have joined through alliance or marriage, others through economic dependence, settlement expansion, elite imitation, or conflict. Material culture associated with Upper Egypt spreads widely through the delta, before and around unification. But objects do not reveal whether their users arrived as settlers, traders, administrators, spouses, or conquerors. A pottery style can travel without a population being displaced. A burial custom can be adopted because it carries prestige. A divine emblem can be borrowed and given a new local meaning. No single explanation fully accounts for the formation of the state. Migration from the drying Sahara adds another layer. People entering or intensifying their presence in the Nile Valley bring livestock practices, technologies, social memories, and ritual habits formed in different landscapes. Contacts with Nubia and the Levant introduce still more material and symbolic possibilities. Egypt's emerging identity is therefore neither purely isolated nor simply imported. It forms through selection. Some foreign-looking motifs appear briefly and disappear. Others are transformed so thoroughly that their external connections become difficult to recognize. Local traditions survive, but they do not remain unchanged. The royal court becomes a powerful workshop for this blending. Craftspeople, officials, ritual specialists, and goods gather from different regions. Images created for the king must be intelligible across more than one community. This encourages symbols with broad reach: the falcon above the land, paired crowns, bovine power, controlled animals, processional boats, and the opposition between ordered center and dangerous margin. Local meanings are not erased. They are translated into a visual language capable of supporting national rule. Writing strengthens the translation. A deity with a written name can be listed, invoked, assigned offerings, and linked to a place. Administrative records allow temples and estates to receive goods regularly. Royal annals can record ceremonies involving divine images. Yet writing also freezes only part of a living tradition. Oral stories, local pronunciations, gestures, songs, and household practices continue beyond what official inscriptions preserve. The surviving record favors institutions wealthy enough to carve stone and maintain archives. The religion of villages remains much harder to see. Even within royal ideology, contradictions survive. Horus and Seth become opponents in myth, representing competing claims, territories, and modes of power. It is tempting to read their conflict as a direct record of a prehistoric war between a Horus-worshipping south and a Seth-worshipping rival region. The evidence does not support such a simple historical decoding. Their relationship develops over time and can express political, cosmic, and familial tensions. Seth is disruptive, but he is also necessary. Horus is the rightful ruler, but his kingship gains meaning through conflict and reconciliation. Early royal names reveal how seriously both powers could matter. Most kings place the Horus falcon above the Sirik, but the second dynasty ruler Peribsen replaces the falcon with the Seth animal. This unusual choice has inspired theories of religious revolution, political division, or a shift in territorial allegiance. The evidence remains incomplete, and Peribsen's motives cannot be recovered with certainty. His successor or later counterpart Khasakemwi goes further, placing both Horus and Seth above his Sirik. The two gods face forward together over the royal name. Rather than proving that one cult has destroyed the other, the emblem presents kingship as the force capable of containing both. That image captures a central Egyptian habit. Opposites can be paired without losing their difference. Upper and Lower Egypt remain distinct as the two lands even when ruled by one king. Nekhbet and Wadjet remain two goddesses while forming one royal title. Desert and valley, east and west, life and death, solar and funerary traditions can be placed into relationships rather than reduced to a single substance. Balance requires distinction. A world without opposing forces would not need the king to hold it together. Gods also rise and fall with political centers. Memphis becomes vital near the junction of valley and delta, and its god Ptah eventually gains enormous theological importance. Heliopolis develops influential solar traditions around Atum and Ra. Abydos grows as the center of Osiris. Thebes, initially less dominant, will later elevate Amun into a national god and eventually combine him with Ra as Amun-Ra. These later developments demonstrate the same mechanism already active in early Egypt. Local cult plus political opportunity can produce national theology. Combination does not mean that divine identities become meaningless. When Amun joins Re, both retain histories and qualities. When Osiris absorbs aspects of Khentimentiu, the Abydos landscape continues to shape the resulting cult. When Horus is linked with solar power as Ra-Horakhti, the falcon and sun do not disappear into an abstract unity. Egyptian theology accumulates names because each name reveals a particular relationship, place, or function. A god may be one and many without creating the contradiction that later readers expect. This layered system also explains why there is no single Egyptian creation story. Different centers place different gods at the beginning. Heliopolis emphasizes Atum and a divine genealogy. Memphis presents creation through Ptah's heart and speech in a text preserved much later. Hermopolis develops a group of primeval powers associated with conditions before creation. Thebes eventually gives Amun a hidden and primordial role. These traditions compete for prestige, yet they are rarely treated as mutually exclusive creeds requiring the rejection of all others. The same is true of divine kingship. The ruler can be living Horus, son of Ra, protected by the two ladies, nourished by Hathor, associated after death with Osiris, and linked to many local gods through temple ritual. These relationships accumulate across centuries. They do not appear fully formed at unification. Each dynasty, region, and institution adds another layer while claiming that the layer has always belonged to the original order. This claim of eternal antiquity is itself political and sacred. A new doctrine gains authority by presenting itself as ancient. A temple rebuilt in stone describes its plan as the plan of the beginning. A newly prominent god is revealed as the hidden source behind older gods. The past expands to make room for the present. Eventually, Egyptian scribes will look back beyond human kings and arrange the gods themselves into dynasties. But those written beginnings are composed long after the prehistoric world they seem to describe. To understand them, the story must turn from archaeology to texts, and from the difficult evidence of origins to the elegant creation stories that later Egyptians placed at the beginning of time. Writing enters Egypt before written mythology does. The earliest tags, labels, sealings, and short inscriptions identify names, goods, institutions, places, and royal authority. They do not preserve long stories explaining how the world began or how the gods first ruled. This creates a difficult gap. By around 3100 BCE, divine kingship and sacred imagery are already highly developed. Yet the earliest large body of surviving Egyptian religious texts appears centuries later in the pyramid texts of the late Old Kingdom. Between image and literature lies a long period during which beliefs continue to change without leaving complete explanations. The pyramid texts begin to appear inside royal pyramids near the end of the 5th dynasty, more than 600 years after the conventional beginning of the First Dynasty and thousands of years after the early Holocene communities of the Green Sahara. They contain spells intended to assist the deceased king, connect him with gods, raise him to the sky, and secure his continued existence. Horus, Seth, Osiris, Ra, Nut, and many other divine beings appear in relationships already dense with mythic history. Yet even these texts do not offer one orderly sacred book. Utterances vary among pyramids, traditions overlap, and references often assume that ritual specialists already know stories the inscriptions mention only briefly. This is the earliest surviving written window into many major divine traditions, but it is not a transcript of predynastic belief. By the time the pyramid texts are carved, Egypt has experienced centuries of centralized government, royal burial, temple development, regional cult interaction, and theological invention. Gods have acquired titles, families, sacred locations, ritual roles, and political associations. Some traditions are certainly older than their first surviving inscription. Others may have been reformulated recently while being presented as ancient. The first written appearance of a god is not necessarily the god's birth, but neither does later prominence prove existence in unchanged form thousands of years earlier. Osiris illustrates the problem. He becomes central to Egyptian funerary religion, ruling the realm of the dead and offering a model of renewed existence. His mythic relationship with Isis, Horus, and Seth becomes one of Egypt's most influential sacred narratives, yet his earliest origins remain uncertain. Abydos was associated first with the Canid funerary god Khentiamentiu, and Osiris later absorbs or overlaps with that local role. His name is securely prominent in Old Kingdom religious texts, but efforts to identify him in much earlier images are often speculative. A predynastic burial concerned with continued identity is not automatically Osirian. The belief that the dead matter precedes the documented god who later organizes that belief represents a different history. Solar symbolism is naturally ancient because the sun structures every day, but the national prominence of Ra is especially connected with Heliopolis and the royal theology of the Old Kingdom. Kings increasingly call themselves sons of Ra, and 5th dynasty rulers build solar temples. This does not mean earlier Egyptians ignored the sun, nor does it prove that the fully developed god Ra was worshipped 10,000 years ago. A natural phenomenon can hold sacred significance long before one named deity becomes its dominant theological expression. Horus has firmer early connections with royal symbolism, yet his later mythology also changes the picture. The falcon god linked with the living king exists in a different relationship from Horus, the posthumous son of Osiris who seeks his rightful inheritance. These identities eventually overlap. The royal god acquires a family history that explains succession through divine conflict. Myth provides a cosmic genealogy for an institution that archaeology shows developing through human politics. Both layers are real parts of Egyptian religion, but they belong to different kinds of evidence. The best-known creation tradition from Heliopolis begins with a primeval watery condition and the self-emergence of Atum. From Atum come Shu and Tefnut, then Geb and Nut, followed by Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys. This group is known as the Ennead. The genealogy turns elemental conditions, landscape, fertility, kingship, death, and succession into a divine family. It is elegant, but it should not be mistaken for Egypt's original and universal creation story. It reflects the theological prestige of Heliopolis and the ability of its priests to connect several powerful cults within one lineage. At Memphis, another tradition gives priority to Ptah, the craftsman god, in the theology preserved on the monument known as the Shabaka stone. Creation occurs through divine thought and speech. Ter conceives in the heart and brings forth through the tongue. The surviving inscription dates to the 25th dynasty, in the late 8th century BCE, though it claims to reproduce an older damaged text. Scholars debate how much earlier the composition truly is. Whatever its exact date, it demonstrates that Egyptian creation could be imagined not only as physical generation, but as intellectual and verbal ordering. It also elevates the god of Memphis by making other divine powers expressions of his creative act. Hermopolis develops traditions centered on 8 primeval beings, often arranged in male and female pairs, associated with darkness, hiddenness, limitless water, and conditions before the formed world. From this unstable beginning, light, or the sun, emerges. Thebes later promotes Amun, whose name suggests hiddenness, as a primordial power transcending other gods. At Esna, Neith can become a creator who brings the world into being. Each center places its own deity near the origin, not because Egyptians continually forgot the correct version, but because creation is being described through several local truths. These traditions can borrow from one another, Atum can merge with Ra, Amun can merge with Ra, Horus can acquire solar forms, Ta can be linked with other gods through theological equivalence. The more connections priests establish, the more ancient and universal a local deity appears. Theology becomes a form of sacred diplomacy among cults, allowing one god to be supreme without requiring every other god to be false. Later temple inscriptions present these systems with great confidence and antiquity. Ritual scenes show the king offering to gods according to an ideal order. Texts claim that temples stand on primeval ground and follow plans established at creation. Yet many surviving versions come from periods far removed from Egypt's beginnings. Ptolemaic and Roman temples can preserve genuinely old traditions, while also expanding them through contemporary scholarship. An inscription carved under Greek or Roman rule may contain language and ideas inherited from much earlier periods, but it is still part of a living religion adapting to its own present. This layered transmission frustrates any attempt to identify one moment when Egypt's first gods emerged. Archaeology shows animals, burials, ritual spaces, local centers, and sacred kingship before it can provide full names. Early texts provide names before they provide continuous myths. Later texts provide elaborate myths while projecting them backward into primeval time. Each source illuminates a different stage and creates a different illusion of completeness. The Turin King list belongs to this later act of looking backward, copied during the reign of Rameses II, more than 2,000 years after unification. It arranges rulers within a sequence extending beyond human kings into divine and semi-divine ages. Its surviving papyrus is fragmented, and its reconstruction requires care. Yet its underlying idea is clear. Human history begins only after sacred beings have already governed the land. For later Egyptians, this does not function as modern archaeological chronology. It makes kingship part of creation itself. That is the source of the seductive claim that gods ruled Egypt thousands of years before the pharaohs. The claim is authentically Egyptian as mythology and historical theology, but it is not contemporary evidence for supernatural dynasties in the early Holocene. The gods appear at the beginning because later scribes place them there. Archaeology reveals a different beginning. Landscapes become symbols. Symbols acquire names. Local powers enter royal systems, and royal systems compose sacred histories. The creation stories are true to how Egyptians understood their world, but they were written after the long human process that created the world they explain. The Turin King list survives in fragments, which is fitting for a document attempting to organize a past already ancient when it was copied. Written during the reign of Ramesses II in the 13th century BCE, the papyrus places divine rulers and other sacred beings before the sequence of human kings. It reflects a vision in which earthly monarchy descends from a primeval age, passing from gods to spirits and eventually to rulers remembered as historical. The damaged condition of the papyrus leaves names, totals, and sequences dependent on careful reconstruction. But its purpose is clear enough. Kingship does not begin as a human invention. It is presented as an institution inherited from the beginning of the world. That vision gives later pharaohs the strongest possible legitimacy. A king does not rule merely because his household controls land, officials, storage, and armed followers. He occupies an office whose origin lies among the gods. The succession of human rulers becomes a continuation of sacred time. Political authority can therefore be challenged in practice while remaining divinely necessary in principle. When one dynasty fails, The ideal of kingship survives because it belongs to a chronology older than any dynasty. The list is invaluable evidence for Egyptian historical thought, but it is not an eyewitness record of gods ruling 10,000 years before the pharaohs. It was copied more than 2 millennia after the unification of Egypt, and far later than the prehistoric communities of Nabta Playa, Gebel Ramla, Badari, Ma'adi, or early Hierakonpolis. Its divine reigns belong to mythology and sacred historiography. Their enormous spans do not provide archaeological dates for supernatural monarchs. They reveal how later Egyptians imagined the depth of their own order. The transition to human kings is no less complicated. Later tradition places Menes near the beginning, yet archaeology gives prominence to rulers such as Nama and Aha. Whether Menes corresponds to either king, combines memories of several rulers, or represents a traditional founder cannot be settled with certainty. Even at the point where myth seems to give way to history, the boundary remains blurred. Egyptian memory is not careless, it is purposeful. It organizes the past according to the needs of kingship, cult, and continuity. Archaeology tells another kind of story. It begins without divine names. The early Holocene landscape contains lakes, grasslands, mobile communities, pottery, wells, animals, burials, and repeated places of gathering. As the Sahara becomes increasingly arid, populations adjust routes and intensify their relationship with the Nile. Villages grow, cemeteries accumulate memory, exchange networks widen, and differences in status become more visible. Sacred animals and ritual objects provide a language for powers that cannot yet be recovered as named personalities. Shrines give those powers local addresses. Political centers gather them into systems. Writing fixes some names while leaving earlier meanings behind. Nothing in this sequence requires a lost civilization ruled by Horus, Osiris, Seth, or Ra thousands of years before the first kings. Nor does removing that claim make Egypt less mysterious. The real emergence is slower, more complex, and harder to explain. There is no single day when a falcon becomes Horus, a cow becomes Hathor, or concern for the dead becomes the cult of Osiris. Symbols move among communities, acquire new associations, and enter institutions capable of preserving them. A local power becomes a royal power. A royal power receives a genealogy. A genealogy becomes a creation story. A creation story is projected backward until the god appears to have existed in complete form from the beginning. Continuity remains real, but it is continuity through transformation. The falcon's height and vision survive inside Horus. Bovine nourishment and celestial enclosure survive inside Hathor, Bat, and other cow goddesses. The cobra's danger becomes royal protection through Wadjet. The desert's unpredictable strength enters Seth. The cemetery landscape of Abydos helps shape the power of Osiris. The flood's renewal, the sun's return, and the emergence of land from water become central images of creation and rebirth. Later priests do not invent these associations from nothing. They inherit landscapes and symbols whose earliest meanings they also reinterpret. The Nile remains beneath all of them, though it is never the sole explanation. Egyptian religion cannot be reduced to nature worship because gods become participants in politics, ethics, healing, household life, foreign relations, craft, sexuality, kingship, and death. Yet the river provides the recurring structure through which change can be imagined as renewal. Water covers land and withdraws, crops appear, the sun disappears and returns, a king dies, and another takes the Horus name, a temple decays, and a ruler rebuilds it while claiming to restore the original plan. Local identity remains equally durable. Horus never loses his connections to particular cult centers, even as he becomes a national god. Osiris carries Abydos into a theology known across Egypt. Ptah's creative power elevates Memphis. Ra brings Heliopolis into royal ideology. Amun's rise transforms Thebes into the home of an imperial deity. The state repeatedly changes its political center, and religion changes with it. But older gods are rarely erased completely. They are paired, merged, subordinated, revived, or given new titles. This flexibility allows Egyptian religion to survive enormous political change. Foreign dynasties rule the country, capitals move, empires expand and contract, languages shift. Greek rulers present themselves before Egyptian gods, and Roman emperors appear on temple walls performing ancient rituals. Isis travels far beyond the Nile Valley and acquires worshippers throughout the Mediterranean world. The religion is not frozen during these centuries. It adapts while describing adaptation as restoration. Its prehistoric foundations are equally dynamic. New climate records show that the African humid period was interrupted by severe droughts, rather than ending in one simple collapse. Ancient DNA suggests deep North African ancestry alongside long-distance connections, while also warning against treating a handful of individuals as entire populations. Sediments and shells refine the history of Nile floods. Excavations in the western desert, Delta, Hierakonpolis, and Abydos reveal communities once missing from older narratives. Every new method adds detail, but none recovers the first prayer spoken beside the river. That missing prayer marks the limit of the story. The most important religious evidence may have been made from wood, reeds, cloth, food, movement, music, and spoken memory. Much has vanished without leaving even a stain in the soil. Stone survives so well that it distorts the imagination, making later Egypt appear more religious than the people who built with perishable materials. Written names survive so clearly that they overshadow unnamed sacred powers. Royal monuments dominate because rulers possessed the resources to preserve their version of reality. The ordinary world beneath those monuments is harder to see. A household may have maintained protective customs unknown to temples. A village may have honoured an ancestral place whose name never entered writing. A regional animal emblem may have disappeared when its community lost influence. Countless sacred traditions must have ended without descendants, while a small number entered royal ideology and became famous. The Egyptian pantheon is therefore not a complete record of prehistoric belief. It is the surviving outcome of selection, political success, local devotion, institutional memory, and historical chance. This is why the earliest gods appear both familiar and unreachable. Familiar, because their forms remain visible: falcon, cow, cobra, crocodile, sun, sky, river, desert, and human body. Unreachable, because the first meanings attached to those forms were spoken in worlds that left no texts. Archaeology can show when certain images grow common, where shrines stand, how graves change, and which towns gain power. It cannot recover every story carried through a ceremony or prove that a later divine name was known centuries before its first inscription. What survives in the record suggests an emergence rather than a revelation. Egyptian religion grows from encounters between people and environment, between local memory and expanding authority, between fear and protection, death and continuity, movement and settlement. The gods become more distinct as society becomes more interconnected. Kingship gathers them into a political cosmos. Writing gives them durable names. Theology places them in families. Myth carries them backward beyond history. The gods who appear to stand before the pharaohs are therefore, in another sense, created alongside them. The sacred powers are older than the state, but the recognizable pantheon takes shape through the same processes that produce centralized rule. Horus helps define the king, and the king helps define Horus. Osiris gives royal death a cosmic pattern, while royal cemeteries help make Osiris nationally important. Divine and political identities grow together until later Egyptians can no longer imagine one without the other. The question of who ruled first finally dissolves into a more revealing question. How did people living beside an unpredictable river learn to describe continuity? Their answer was not written once. It accumulated through graves, animals, shrines, crowns, boats, offerings, names, and stories. It changed while insisting that the deepest order never changed at all. Long before temple walls rose above the floodplain, morning came quietly to the Nile. Light touched the eastern bank. Birds moved through reeds. The river carried water from rains no one beside it had seen, and the desert waited only a short distance beyond the green. People watched the same boundaries that would later divide worlds in sacred texts. They knew where life gathered, where the dead rested, and where familiar ground gave way to uncertainty. Their names are mostly gone. The names of the powers they approached are gone as well. What remains is a pot placed beside a body, a line cut into stone, a post hole from a vanished enclosure, pigment worn from a palette, and the bones of an animal given an unusual resting place. These fragments do not form a complete belief system. They are small interruptions in oblivion. Centuries pass, and the fragments gather meanings. The falcon receives a royal name. The cow carries the sun. The western cemetery becomes a divine kingdom. Water before creation becomes a primeval ocean. Human rulers place themselves inside a chain beginning with gods. Each generation remembers something, changes something, and forgets more than it preserves. That is how ancient religion survives, not as a voice untouched by time, but as an echo repeatedly given a new chamber. The original sound cannot be isolated. It moves through later temples, myths, king lists, excavated graves, museum cases, and modern attempts to imagine the world before writing. Now the river moves through darkness again. The old lakes of the Sahara have dried, the wooden shrines have disappeared, and the first stories have escaped every archive. Yet the Nile continues north beneath the same sky. Somewhere above the floodplain, a falcon turns in the morning air. Its shadow crosses water, reeds, cultivated earth, and the pale beginning of desert, joining for a moment the separate worlds from which Egypt's gods once rose.